Hi there, welcome back to Sleepy Whisper. Tonight, I invite you to gently lower the volume to a soft, comfortable level. Lie down, close your eyes, and allow the world to slow down with you. Let your thoughts drift like clouds. Let your breath deepen, and let silence wrap around you like a warm blanket, because now it's time to sleep. And as you do, I'll tell you a quiet story, not to excite your mind, but to soothe it. This is the first story in our Sleepy History series, The Long Road of a Silk Merchant from Venice, a slow tale of distant roads, of markets and dust, of quiet ambition, and the rhythm of footsteps echoing across empires. If you find comfort in this quiet space, please consider giving the video a gentle like and subscribing to the channel so I can whisper you to sleep again tomorrow night. Now, let's begin our story. The year was 1323, and the air over Venice carried the faint scent of salt and spice. In the narrow alleyways where canals whispered against stone steps, a man named Matteo stirred before sunrise. He was not a nobleman, nor a knight, nor a scholar. He was a merchant, one among hundreds who called Venice their home. But unlike many, Matteo did not dream of the wealth locked in palazzos, or the acclaim of the Doge's court. His dreams stretched further east, beyond Constantinople, beyond the Caspian, beyond the deserts, to the cities he had only read about in maps stained with seawater and time. His father had once traded cloth with Armenian caravans near Tabriz, and his grandfather, they said, had died on the road to Samarkand. For Matteo, the road was not just business, it was a legacy. That morning, he rose in his modest home near the Campo San Polo, where the shadows were still long and the bells had yet to toll. He packed carefully, bolts of dyed linen, narrow vials of Venetian glass, and strings of coral harvested by Sardinian divers. These were not luxuries, but tokens, things meant to be bartered far away where Venetian ducats held no sway. He wore a tunic of simple wool, faded by salt air, and a belt that had once belonged to his uncle. At his side, a notebook bound in thin leather, half ledger, half diary. He kissed his sleeping wife's forehead and whispered a promise that he would return before the leaves fell twice. Their child, just 4, stirred slightly, but did not wake. Outside, the city stirred with its quiet rituals, fishermen dragging crates, bakers tending their fires, and gondoliers muttering to each other as they prepared for the day's crossings. Matteo's barge was modest, just 2 hired men and a low deck covered in oilcloth to protect his wares. By the time the sun rose over the terracotta roofs, the boat had left the Grand Canal behind. They moved eastward through the Venetian lagoon, toward the Adriatic, where open water awaited. The wind was light, the sea calm. It would be several days before they reached Ragusa, and then onward by land to Constantinople. From there, the journey would be even slower. Days by horse, weeks on foot, overland with caravans, each mile filled with uncertainty. But for Matteo, slowness was not a burden. It was the way. The world did not rush on the Silk Road. It whispered, it tested, it waited. His first nights were spent in small ports, where the dialects shifted slightly and the stars felt a little more distant from home. In Zara, he bartered a small mirror for dried dates. In Durrës, he watched a Byzantine priest chant alone at dawn. By the time they reached Thessaloniki, Matteo's face had darkened with sun and dust, and his boots were already in need of mending. But his eyes were brighter. In Constantinople, he spent a full week within the Genoese quarter, checking his maps, waiting for the next merchant train bound for Trebizond. He listened to Greek, Latin, and Turkish spoken in the same breath. He met a fellow traveler from Florence, who warned of bandits near the Euphrates. Matteo smiled politely and kept listening. He was not fearless, but he believed in the road. At night, by candlelight, he would write in his little notebook. Not numbers, those were for the day, but thoughts, sounds, a description of a fig tree outside his window, the way the incense smoke curled at a church altar, the silence of men who had lost their partners on the road. He wondered what the markets of Bukhara smelled like in winter, whether the rumors of paper money in the Yuan Empire were true, whether he, a son of a cloth seller, might one day walk the streets of Chang'an or Kashgar. Outside the city, the caravan assembled slowly, camels brought up from Anatolia, horses with foreign saddles, wagons creaking with grain, men from different tongues learning to nod and smile in silence. And Matteo, quietly, stepping into his place among them, not with weapons, but with patience. His goods were packed tightly now, wrapped in burlap and bound with cord. And as the sun rose over the crumbling walls of Constantinople, the caravan began to move, eastward, into the dust, into the silence, into history. The road east from Constantinople was not paved with ambition, but with stone and dust and time. As the caravan moved slowly out of the city gates, Matteo kept his gaze steady, neither eager nor fearful. The city with its golden domes and ancient walls faded behind him, and what stretched ahead was not yet land, but a silence broken only by the slow rhythm of hooves, wheels, and distant wind. They followed the old trade paths, routes carved not by mapmakers, but by generations of footsteps, each one layered in the earth like threads in a tapestry. The pace was deliberate, a few leagues each day. They passed through rolling hills where shepherds waved from afar, their flocks grazing near ruined columns that once belonged to empires long gone. Matteo did not speak much. He observed. He listened. He shared bread with an Armenian spice seller who told tales of his father's journey to Mosul. He traded a length of coral for a pouch of dried apricots. At night, they camped near low rivers or beneath groves of olive trees, building small fires that flickered against the canvas of sleeping beasts and quiet men. The sky was wide, the stars clearer than in Venice, as if the heavens themselves opened further the farther he walked from home. He wrote by the dim light of oil, his entries calm, almost meditative. Today, he scribbled, we passed a Roman aqueduct still standing, though no water has flowed through it in 100 years. A boy in our train found a carved stone shaped like a fish. No one could tell if it was pagan or Christian. These were not records of trade, but moments, slow fragments of time held still in ink. By the third week, the terrain changed. The hills gave way to drier land, the wind carried sand, and the language of the villagers became less familiar. In a town near Erzurum, he watched children run barefoot through the market square, chasing a goat with laughter that sounded universal. He met a calligrapher there, an old man with ink-stained hands who sold verses from the Quran, written in golden script. Matteo bought one. He did not understand the words, but he found peace in the shape of the letters. They reminded him of waves. Further east, the caravan joined with another group bound for Tabriz. More animals, more men, more stories, and more tongues. The road narrowed at times to little more than a trail scratched into stone. They crossed bridges that creaked, valleys echoing with birdsong in the morning and jackals at night. One evening, Matteo helped repair a broken axle in silence, his hands blistered but steady. The driver, a Turk named Aydin, handed him a fig and said simply, "You are slow but strong." Matteo nodded. There was no rush. Every day was the destination. By the time they reached the outskirts of Tabriz, the caravan had changed. Some faces had left, others joined, but Matteo remained, a quiet figure with a dusty tunic and a worn notebook. Tabriz was loud compared to the road, its markets full of color and movement, its air heavy with spice and voices. But even here, Matteo found stillness in the corners. He sat in a tea house watching steam rise from brass kettles. He bartered Venetian glass for bolts of silk dyed deep blue. He met a scholar who had traveled once to Damascus, and who spoke of books written entirely in verse. Matteo listened. He always listened. He stayed in Tabriz for 6 days. On the 5th, he sent a letter westward with a returning merchant. It was short. "I am well, I have seen mountains. I dream of you beneath a different moon." On the 7th day, the road called again. The next stretch would be harder, across arid plains toward Nishapur, then south toward the deserts. But Matteo did not flinch. He repacked his goods, tied his boots tighter, and joined the line once more. The east did not move quickly, it breathed, and Matteo breathed with it. From Tabriz, the road turned quieter again, stretching like a ribbon of dust and memory into the heart of Persia. Matteo traveled now with a smaller group, 5 men, 2 pack horses, and a guide who had once served a Mongol governor but now walked with a limp and seldom spoke. The days began earlier, the sun harder, the wind carrying the scent of dry herbs and distant fires. There were fewer trees, fewer towns, fewer distractions. In the early light, the land seemed endless, a canvas of shifting sand and muted color where thoughts could echo without reply. Matteo walked mostly in silence. His mind no longer rushed with numbers or plans. He had stopped thinking of profit weeks ago. Instead, he watched shadows move across hills. He counted stars. He learned to wrap his scarf against the dust just so. He no longer looked for signs, only for the rhythm of each step. In a small village near Zanjan, he watched an old woman spin silk thread beside her grandson. She said nothing. She just smiled as her hands worked like water, smooth and unhurried. Matteo sat nearby and offered no questions. The boy gave him a piece of dried melon. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "There is something sacred in the silence between strangers." The road bent south toward Kazvin. They passed ruins older than memory, broken towers standing alone in fields of wheat. Camels watched from the distance, unmoving. The caravan was slow but steady. One man fell ill and was left in the care of villagers. Another went ahead with a faster group. Matteo stayed, not because he feared the unknown, but because he trusted in patience. In Kazvin, the sky seemed lower, the buildings flatter, and the faces softer. He met a bookseller who spoke broken Italian. They shared coffee under a vine-covered awning, and the bookseller recited a line from a Persian poem. "The road is long, and we are only dust carried by the feet of time." Matteo did not understand every word, but he remembered the sound. The next morning they departed early, climbing slowly into dry hills where wild goats watched from above. The trail became harder, rocky, winding, uncertain. They passed a caravan coming the other way, men with salt from the Caspian, women in veils, children sleeping under blankets. There were no greetings, just nods. A brief pause in two journeys heading in opposite directions. Matteo's feet ached, but he did not complain. The pain felt honest, like the crack in a clay jar that still holds water. By the time they reached the edges of the desert, Matteo's tunic was stained with sweat, and the leather of his satchel had darkened. They stayed 2 nights in a caravanserai, a low stone building with a central courtyard and cold water drawn from a well that tasted faintly of earth. Traders from India, China, and the far north gathered there. Languages mixed in the evening air like incense. Matteo listened. He always listened. He traded a silver pin for a small pouch of saffron. He watched a musician play a bowed instrument with just 2 strings. The sound was slow, haunting, perfect. That night, Matteo wrote only 1 line in his notebook. "Some places teach you to be still." When they left the caravanserai, the air had turned dry as ash. The desert ahead was vast, flat, and pale, broken only by the shimmer of heat and the occasional thorn bush. Travel was slower now. They moved in the early morning and late afternoon, resting at midday under makeshift tents. The wind whispered stories no one could understand. Dust coated every surface, but no one minded. The silence grew deeper. Matteo no longer measured time in days, but in moments. The weight of a full water skin, the crackle of fire at night, the soft sound of sand shifting under his feet. They reached a lone well, miles from anything. A man there offered dates and said nothing else. He had lived by that well for years. Matteo left him a strip of silk. He did not know why. It just felt right. At sunset, the desert turned gold, then rose, then ash again. The sky became a dome of stars, too many to name. Matteo lay beside the fire, his arms folded behind his head, and whispered to the night, "I am far from home, but I am not lost." And somewhere between the silence and the stars, he began to understand that the road was not something to conquer, but something to become. The desert did not end in a sudden shift, but in a slow fading of silence into sound. First the distant barking of a dog, then the soft jingle of a trader's harness, and finally the quiet murmur of voices carried on wind. Matteo and the others reached a low valley where the sand gave way to dry grass and thorny shrubs, and then to scattered trees. The city of Nishapur was still days away, but signs of life began to gather like threads before a weave. A farmer with a crooked staff pointed them toward a safer well. A boy offered clay pots for sale, each stamped with a symbol that Matteo did not recognize. The group moved slower now, not from fatigue, but from the weight of proximity. After so much stillness, even the presence of strangers felt loud. On the 3rd morning, clouds appeared on the horizon. Thin and streaked like brushstrokes across the pale sky, they gave little shade, but Matteo stared at them for hours, grateful for the shift. That night, they camped near a riverbed that held only a trickle of water. The stars shimmered above, but the ground was warm beneath their blankets. One of the pack horses coughed throughout the night. The guide said nothing, but in the morning, he tightened the animal's saddle and led it by hand. In this world, small discomforts were accepted like dust on the wind. Annoying, but expected. When they finally reached the outskirts of Nishapur, the earth felt firmer, the smells richer. This city was old, older than Venice, once shattered by Genghis Khan's armies and slowly rebuilt over generations. Its walls were lower now, its gates quieter, but the air still hummed with trade. Spices, scrolls, rugs, glass, everything passed through this place, sometimes with noise, sometimes with grace. Matteo walked the bazaar in silence, brushing against fabrics that shimmered like water and listening to prices called in a dozen tongues. He bought nothing, not yet. He had come to observe, not to spend. In the corner of the market, he found a bookseller with poor vision but perfect memory. The man recited ancient poetry from the Khwarazm region and offered Matteo a worn copy of a manuscript bound in cracked leather. Matteo accepted it not for value, but for the handwriting inside. Careful, curved, almost shy. That evening, he sat under a wooden balcony and copied a line into his own notebook. Let the road carve you into who you were meant to become. The next morning, Matteo met an older merchant named Farid, who offered to guide him toward Merv. Farid had a slow voice, the kind that moved like sand over stone. He spoke often of loss, but always with softness. His wife had died years ago. His son had disappeared during a border raid. Still, Farid laughed easily, mostly at the way Matteo folded maps, as if they would remain clean forever. The road does not care for your order, he said once. Matteo smiled. He had already learned that. They left Nishapur with just 3 animals between them. Farid brought opium resin and medicinal herbs wrapped in wax cloth. Matteo carried silks, coral, and the small manuscript. The landscape between Nishapur and Merv was less harsh than the desert, but no easier. Rocky passes gave way to low plains, filled with dry wind. Occasionally, they passed a shrine or broken stone markers, reminders that others had come this way long before, some returning, many not. They stopped often, not out of necessity, but out of rhythm. Travel, for them, had become a kind of meditation. At midday, they drank tea, heated on flat stones, and said little. At night, they shared small stories. Farid once met a blind cook in Balkh who made the finest lamb stew Matteo had ever tasted. Matteo spoke of a storm he once watched from the top of San Marco's bell tower, when the water below looked like hammered silver. They were not seeking to impress each other, they were simply passing time. In the wide quiet between towns, Matteo's thoughts wandered more freely. He imagined his wife brushing their daughter's hair in the soft morning light of Venice. He wondered if the streets still smelled of fish and rain. He missed the bells but not the noise. He missed the sea but not the hurry. When they reached a small encampment 3 days from Merv, Matteo gave a child a slice of dried pear and received in return a pebble shaped like a heart. He kept it in his pouch. That night he wrote, "Kindness survives even here, perhaps especially here." Merv was still distant, and beyond that, the cities of Bactria and Samarkand. But Matteo no longer counted the miles. He moved not to arrive, but to continue. He had become part of the road, quiet, slow, steady, a thread in something much older than maps could show. And as the stars returned, familiar and ancient, Matteo breathed deep, laid his head against his pack, and slept without dreams. The city of Merv revealed itself not with towering walls or trumpets of arrival, but with a quiet gathering of signs. A small rise in traffic along the dusty road, the increase in colorful fabrics worn by passing strangers, and the sudden scent of cumin and dried citrus in the wind. For Matteo, the approach felt familiar, though he had never walked this land before. Merv had once been among the greatest cities of the East, a jewel in the desert, its libraries renowned, its scholars respected across continents. Now it breathed softer, its grandeur worn down by siege and sand and time. The walls stood low, the gates creaked slightly, and the domes no longer shone like they once did. But still, life flowed through its arteries like blood through a resting heart. Matteo and Farid entered just past sunrise, when the market stalls were still being prepared, and the air was cool enough to move easily. They found shelter in a modest inn, owned by a widowed woman with silver-streaked hair and an eye for fair travelers. The room was bare, just a mat, a jug of water, and a hook for a satchel, but it felt like comfort after so many nights beneath open skies. Matteo removed his boots and let his toes touch stone for the first time in weeks. In that moment, it was enough. During the day, they explored the market, walking slowly through rows of traders whose voices rose and fell like the calls of seabirds in Venice. There were goods from India, horses from the steppe, tea from the east, and salt from the south. Matteo touched nothing at first. He simply watched the way one man displayed cinnamon in tightly rolled bundles, the way another woman wove small baskets with reeds so fine they looked like thread. The silk he had carried from Venice, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and bound in twine, remained hidden in his pack. He would not sell today, perhaps not tomorrow. This was a place to learn before one could trade. That evening, they returned to the inn, where the widow served them a stew of lentils and garlic, spiced with something Matteo could not name but found oddly familiar. After the meal, he sat on the low steps outside, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun dipped behind the adobe buildings. Children ran through the alley chasing each other, their laughter echoing softly. Matteo wrote slowly in his notebook, "There is peace in places that have endured." The following days passed without urgency. Farid made a few exchanges, mostly herbs and spices, while Matteo visited a small mosque where an old man read aloud from a manuscript that had survived 3 dynasties. Though he did not understand the words, Matteo closed his eyes and let the cadence move through him. The architecture of the city fascinated him. Curved arches, faded tiles, carved wooden doors that creaked but never resisted. He traced the grooves with his fingers and imagined the hands that had shaped them centuries ago. There was a bathhouse where he finally washed the dust from his skin, and for the first time in many weeks, Matteo saw his own reflection clearly. His face was darker from the sun, his beard fuller, his eyes more tired, but there was something else too, a stillness, a groundedness, a presence that had not been there when he left Venice. He no longer looked like a man in search of the world. He looked like a man who had become part of it. On the 5th night, Farid announced he would not continue eastward. His knees ached, and he missed his daughter's cooking. Matteo accepted this without protest. The road, he had learned, was filled with partings that did not need sorrow. They hugged once, firm and brief, and then Farid was gone by morning, his footsteps lost in the rhythm of the city. Alone now, Matteo sat by the city's edge and looked out toward the horizon where the sky kissed the steppe. Somewhere out there was Samarkand. Beyond that, perhaps even the dream of Cathay. But he no longer rushed toward names. He would stay in Merv a while longer, perhaps trade, perhaps wait, perhaps simply breathe. And as the stars rose once again over this quiet city, Matteo closed his notebook, folded his hands over his chest, and listened to the silence as if it were a story he had heard before, and had only now begun to understand. Matteo remained in Merv longer than he had planned, though he could no longer remember exactly how many days had passed since his arrival. Time moved differently within the city's gentle rhythm, marked not by bells or the turning of gears, but by the way the morning sun shifted across the pale courtyard wall, or the subtle change in the smell of bread from the bakery around the corner. The silk he had carried for so long remained carefully stored, untouched, while he studied the flow of buyers and sellers, learning how prices shifted with the wind and how silence could be just as persuasive as words. He spent hours sitting beneath a fig tree near the spice quarter, watching how the old merchants communicated with the nod of a head or the folding of a cloth, never needing to raise their voices. He noticed that the best trades did not happen quickly, but through days of shared tea, quiet talk, and a mutual understanding that patience was a form of wisdom. One afternoon, a trader from Bukhara approached him with an interest in Venetian coral. The man, with a face weathered by desert wind and eyes soft with time, examined the strands carefully, running the beads between his fingers as if listening to a language only he could hear. He did not ask for a price. Instead, he invited Matteo to his home for tea. They sat on a rooftop terrace overlooking the city, where the wind carried the scent of cumin and rosewater, and the sun dropped behind the horizon with deliberate grace. Over small cups of cardamom tea, the man spoke of his father's journey to Antioch, of silk caravans lost to storms, and of a coin kept hidden in his shoe for 30 years, never spent, only held as a reminder of the day he survived a bandit attack. Matteo listened, not for business advantage, but because the stories filled something in him he had not known was empty. He left the house without having made a sale, but with an invitation to return. The trade, they both understood, would come later. In the mornings, Matteo walked the quieter parts of the city, observing how, even in ruin, Merv breathed with dignity. Cracked tiles still shimmered in broken patterns. A collapsed minaret still cast a graceful shadow. He stopped often to sketch in his notebook, not with the skill of an artist, but with the curiosity of a man learning to see. A child once approached and pointed to his page, asking if the drawing was a mountain or a camel. Matteo smiled and said, "Both." The child laughed and ran off. Days melted into each other. A light rain fell one evening, the first he had seen in weeks, and it seemed the whole city paused to breathe it in. Matteo stood beneath an overhang and watched as the dust turned to mud, the rooftops darkened, and the scent of wet stone filled the air. He did not rush for shelter. He stood in it, allowing the water to streak across his face. Feeling clean, not in the body, but in the soul. That night, he wrote, "The rain does not ask who you are. It only invites you to feel." Later that week, he met a weaver named Lala, whose stall near the northern gate displayed tapestries of deep green and burnt orange. She was younger than Matteo, but her eyes held the calm of someone who had known both beauty and loss. They spoke often, sometimes of fabrics, sometimes of dreams, sometimes of nothing at all. She told him that she wove not for profit, but to remember her mother's hands. Matteo told her about the canals of Venice, the way the light danced on the water during autumn. She said she hoped to see that one day. He hoped she would. Their friendship unfolded like everything else in Merv, unhurried, gentle, without expectation. Matteo began to feel that the road had brought him here not as a stop on a longer journey, but as a quiet answer to a question he had forgotten how to ask. Still, Samarkand waited in the east, its name glowing faintly in his thoughts like the outline of a star behind a cloud. When he finally decided it was time to leave, he did so without a farewell. He left a folded piece of silk for Lala, a token of all that had passed between them in silence. He rose early, packed without sound, and stepped into the soft light of dawn before the streets fully stirred. As he crossed the eastern gate, Matteo turned once to look back, not with longing, but with gratitude. Merv had given him more than trade, more than rest. It had given him stillness. And now, carrying its quiet with him, he continued toward Samarkand, his footsteps slow, steady, and full of purpose, as the road opened once more into the unknown. The road from Merv to Samarkand was longer than Matteo had imagined, not in distance, but in quiet complexity. It wound through wide valleys and low windswept hills, across dry grasslands where the sky seemed too large for the earth below it. There were no milestones, no markers to note his progress, only the steady crunch of his boots on shifting soil and the occasional flutter of birds startled from dry branches. Matteo traveled now with a new caravan, this one smaller and quieter than the others. A Persian woman with dark braids and a keen mind for spices led the group. Her name Yasmin, though few called her anything at all. She moved with a quiet authority, issuing instructions with hand gestures and glances, rarely speaking unless necessary. The others respected her, and Matteo did the same. He offered his goods without flair, sharing coral and silk samples one evening after supper. Yasmin accepted 2 bolts for a parcel of dried herbs and did not ask his story. In return, Matteo asked for nothing but permission to walk with them. The days blurred into a soft rhythm. The caravan would rise before sunrise, move slowly until the sun grew harsh, then rest under makeshift shelters until the late afternoon. Then they would travel again, stopping only when the horizon faded into shadow. The landscape shifted subtly. Hills grew steeper, vegetation changed from thorny brush to tall, pale grasses. At times, distant mountains appeared like ghosts in the haze, only to vanish the next morning. They passed through crumbling villages where dogs barked from rooftops, and women carried water in copper pots balanced with effortless grace. Matteo observed it all, sketching small details in his notebook. A cracked fountain shaped like a lion's mouth, a child's drawing etched into the dirt with a stick, an abandoned watchtower with ivy crawling halfway up its stone spine. These images stayed with him, not as memories, but as threads of a tapestry still being woven. At night, the caravan gathered in silence. Small fires were lit, tea brewed slowly in worn kettles, and food passed hand to hand without fuss. Matteo often sat apart, not from distance, but from habit. He had become content in stillness, more present than he had ever been in his youth. He listened to the wind, the crackle of firewood, and the low voices of fellow travelers sharing stories in tongues he could not understand. One evening, as the sun dipped behind a wide plain, Yasmin joined him near the edge of camp. She handed him a fig, still warm from her pack. "You do not ask questions," she said. Matteo smiled gently and replied, "I've learned more by watching." She nodded once, seemingly satisfied, and left without another word. That night, he wrote, "Some people are like the wind, never still, but never loud." Days passed. Matteo helped repair a broken wheel, traded 2 small beads for a bowl of almonds, and guided a horse through a narrow pass while others cleared fallen stones. He did not feel like a guest anymore. He had become part of the motion, a quiet figure in a quiet procession moving toward the edge of the world. When they reached a wide river, Yasmin led them to a shallow crossing known only to seasoned travelers. The water was cold, fast, and clear, and Matteo paused halfway through to feel the current against his legs. He thought of the canals in Venice, the way the tide shifted near the docks, and for a moment he imagined he heard church bells in the distance. But there were no bells here, only the sound of water and the creak of carts. On the far side, they rested beneath a grove of almond trees. The air was scented with blossoms, and Matteo could hear bees moving lazily between flowers. He laid back on his pack, eyes half closed, and allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. Not sleep, not thought, just the pure act of being. That evening, a boy from the caravan asked to see his coral. Matteo showed him gently, letting the sunlight play on each bead. The boy's eyes widened, and he touched them as if they might vanish. Matteo gave him a single piece, small, smooth, the color of deep flame, and said nothing. The boy ran off smiling. Matteo smiled too, not because he had given something away, but because he had nothing to expect in return. They continued east, following a trail that curved around low cliffs where goats watched from above like sentries. In the distance, the towers of Samarkand began to rise, not clearly, but as shapes in the shimmering light, like promises. Matteo felt no rush. The road would take him there in time, and until then, each step was its own arrival. That night, beneath stars scattered like salt across the black sky, he whispered to no one, "I have not seen everything, but I have seen enough to know I want to keep going." The road into Samarkand was not marked by triumph or grand arrival. There were no fanfares, no banners announcing the end of the journey. Instead, there was a quiet narrowing of space, a slow thickening of sound, and a gentle shift in the weight of the air. The dust that had followed Matteo for so many miles softened underfoot as the caravan passed through fertile land fed by the Zarafshan River. Trees returned, tall, slender, their leaves catching the light with a kind of shimmer that felt like a whisper from the earth. The sky above remained vast, but somehow more tender. Farmers worked silently in fields of wheat, their sickles moving in steady arcs. Children ran barefoot along low walls, their laughter trailing like ribbons behind them. And then, beyond a final rise, Samarkand revealed itself, not as a single moment, but as a series of impressions. Turquoise domes catching the late sun, narrow alleys branching off wide markets, and the low murmur of 1,000 quiet exchanges. The caravan passed through the city's edge and began to dissolve into its many corners. Traders peeled away to find their partners. Camels were led toward shaded stables. Horses drank deeply from stone troughs. Matteo remained still for a moment, standing just beyond the first gate, unsure whether to move or to breathe. He had imagined Samarkand many times along the road. He had tried to picture its sound, its scent, its rhythm, but now that it stood before him, real and alive, he let all those expectations fall away like sand from his shoulders. He entered slowly, walking alone. The streets were wide, paved with flat stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Markets opened into shaded courtyards. Small fountains sang in corners, where elders gathered to speak in hushed tones. Matteo wandered without purpose. He passed under an arch carved with verses in Arabic. paused by a vendor selling dates wrapped in fig leaves, and watched a painter touch blue pigment to ceramic tile with the precision of a prayer. He said little, he touched nothing, he simply absorbed. That evening, he found a room in a quiet quarter of the city, a modest dwelling with a low wooden ceiling and windows that faced east. There was a mat, a basin of water, and silence. Matteo unpacked slowly. He placed his notebook beside the bed, his satchel near the door, and sat cross-legged as the last light of day turned the room gold. He did not write that night. He only closed his eyes and listened to the distant rhythm of a city breathing in its sleep. In the days that followed, Matteo became a part of Samarkand's quiet pattern. He rose early, walked its streets before the sun grew strong, and spent hours watching rather than speaking. He sat in the courtyard of a madrasa, listening to students recite texts in languages he could not follow. He stood beside a woman spinning silk thread so fine it vanished between her fingers. He walked the Bibi Kanim mosque at dawn, when the marble still held the coolness of night. He bought nothing. He sold nothing. Not yet. He needed to understand the city first. The goods he had carried from Venice, his coral, his silks, his beads of glass, remained packed away, not forgotten, but not urgent. He no longer measured time by distance or trade. He measured it by the weight of a glance, the arc of a shadow, the shape of a voice echoing down a narrow street. One afternoon, Matteo returned to the same fountain he had passed on his first day. An old man was there, reading from a book with frayed edges. Matteo sat quietly on the opposite bench. After some time, the old man looked up and said, "You have walked far." Matteo nodded but did not speak. The man smiled, closed the book, and added, "Far enough to become someone else." Matteo didn't answer. He simply bowed his head in agreement. That night, he opened his notebook and wrote, "Samarkand is not a city, it is a mirror." He spent a week in the city before finally unwrapping the silk. He laid it out carefully on a low table beneath a blue awning, arranging the folds so the light caught the threads just right. He did not advertise. He did not call out. He simply sat behind it, patient and still. A young woman approached first, her gaze steady, her hands clean. She touched the fabric lightly, asked no price, and returned the next day with an elder who spoke Persian and Turkish and a little broken Italian. They struck a deal with few words. More followed. Traders from the east, curious about glass beads shaped like droplets of rain. A scholar who bartered 3 pages of old poetry for a strip of coral. A craftsman who offered a carved wooden box in exchange for a bolt of red silk. Matteo did not gain wealth, but he gained something else, something he could not name but felt deeply. He belonged here, for now, in this place of slow exchanges and quiet light. And as he closed his stall each night, folding the fabric with hands that had crossed mountains and deserts, he would whisper to himself, not with pride but with quiet peace, "I was never lost, I was only becoming." Samarkand settled into Matteo like a long exhale. It did not overwhelm him with its beauty, though there was beauty in every corner. In the turquoise domes that caught the early sun, in the shadowed tiles beneath his feet, in the fragrance of ripe melons and honeyed almonds drifting from the morning markets. It was not a city that shouted its splendor, it whispered it, slowly, gently, with the confidence of something ancient and sure. Matteo moved through its streets now, as if he had always belonged, not as a merchant or a visitor, but as a quiet observer folded into the rhythm of a place that had seen many come and go. He would rise before dawn and walk the narrow alleys, letting the silence wrap around him like a shawl. The world was softest at that hour, the stones still cool beneath his soles, the air touched with the faintest breath of rosewater from windowsills above. He passed weavers who had already begun their day, their looms creaking like wooden wind chimes, the threads snapping into place in patterns older than language. Children sometimes followed him for a few paces, giggling and then disappearing behind corners like leaves blown by a breeze. Matteo smiled without needing to speak. He had long since shed the urgency of conversation. The goods he had carried from Venice had slowly found new hands. One length of deep green silk had gone to a bride whose mother had offered a single gold coin and a prayer in exchange. Another was traded for a hand-carved chest, inlaid with bone and brass, which Matteo did not need but accepted with reverence. He no longer weighed trades by value, but by meaning. The coral he had once polished so carefully now adorned the neck of an elderly storyteller who recited tales in the square each evening, her voice weathered but steady, her eyes bright as stars. Sometimes Matteo would sit on the edge of the crowd and listen, not for the story itself, which he could not always follow, but for the cadence, the music in her voice, the way the words moved like water down a gentle stream. In the quiet hours of afternoon, when the city slowed to avoid the heat, Matteo often sat beneath a fig tree in a small courtyard behind a bookseller's stall. He had met the old man by chance, browsing through parchment scrolls and ink-stained ledgers. They had shared tea once, then again, until it became a habit. The bookseller, named Rahim, spoke slowly and with humor, his laughter soft and wheezy, like a sigh released after holding too long. They rarely discussed business. Instead, Rahim would read old poetry aloud, translating as he went, or pose questions that required no answer. One afternoon he asked, "What is the weight of a quiet life?" Matteo had no reply, but he carried the question with him like a pebble in his pocket. One evening, as the call to prayer echoed through the city, Matteo climbed a set of worn stairs to a rooftop overlooking the main square. Lanterns flickered below, casting golden pools on the stone. The city, so alive in the day, now pulsed with stillness, like a heart resting between beats. He sat alone, wrapped in his shawl, watching the sky change. The stars came slowly, each one appearing without announcement, as if remembering its place. Matteo traced their paths with his eyes, remembering the same stars over Venice, over the plains of Anatolia, over the desert near Merv. The sky, he realized, had always been his only map. That night, he did not write in his notebook. He simply held it in his lap, fingers resting on its worn cover, and let his thoughts move without needing form. The pages already held enough. His journey was no longer something to document, but something to live. In the days that followed, strangers became familiar faces. The baker near the mosque gave him the end piece of bread without asking. The boy who had once admired his coral now waved from the rooftops. Even the stray dog near the fountain began to follow him, keeping a quiet pace a few steps behind. Matteo gave it no name, but sometimes left scraps wrapped in cloth where it liked to sleep. He did not know how long he would stay. He no longer marked his days with plans. Samarkand, with its slow breath and generous silences, had become not a destination, but a way of being. It asked nothing of him except presence. And for now, that was more than enough. Seasons in Samarkand did not change with sudden winds or loud colors, but with quiet gestures. The mornings grew cooler. The light shifted slightly on the tiled domes. The scent of fresh bread turned deeper, as if the flour had rested longer before rising. Matteo noticed these changes not through calendars or markets, but through the way his body responded to the air, the way his hands lingered longer over warm tea, the way he reached instinctively for a shawl in the early hours. He had been in Samarkand long enough now that time no longer felt like something passing. It simply was. Each day unfolded not as a step forward or a repetition, but as a presence. The world no longer asked him where he was going. It only asked if he was here. The trades had slowed. He had sold most of the silk he once carried across mountains, rivers, and cities. A few pieces remained, kept not for their value, but for reasons he did not need to name. He had more than enough to live, more than he ever needed really, and so he gave more freely now. A small pouch of glass beads went to a child whose sister was to be married. A bolt of cloth was sewn into a wedding dress for a seamstress he had never met. He did not ask for names. He only watched from afar, content to know that something he once carried had found a purpose beyond his own hands. Matteo began to walk farther from the city center, into the quieter outskirts where the streets narrowed and the walls bore faded murals of forgotten kings and poets. He spent hours beneath one particular fig tree near a crumbling school where boys still gathered to recite lines from old texts, their voices overlapping like birdsong. Some days he brought fruit or bread for them. Other days he brought nothing but silence. They accepted both. One morning, while seated there, a traveler approached him. She was young, dressed in the colors of the western steppes, her eyes bright with the urgency of someone at the beginning of a long journey. She asked, in hesitant Persian, if he knew the road to Herat. Matteo smiled gently, nodded, and described the way, the turns, the wells, the places where the wind shifted and the path became stone. She listened carefully, then thanked him and turned to leave. But before she did, she asked a quiet question. "Is it worth the distance?" Matteo paused for a long moment before answering. "The road gives what you cannot name," he said, "and takes what you never needed." She nodded, unsure if she understood, but grateful nonetheless. He watched her disappear down the path he had once walked, her figure small against the rising sun. That evening, Matteo returned to the rooftop where he had once watched the stars. The sky was clear, the city below humming softly with life. He sat cross-legged, feeling the warmth of the stone beneath him, and opened his notebook, not to write but to turn its pages. Each entry held a different landscape, a memory carried in ink and dust. He ran his fingers over the faded lines and thought of all the versions of himself who had written them. The merchant at sea, the traveler in the desert, the listener in the courtyard. They were all here, all quiet now. In the final page, he wrote one last line. "I have arrived many times, and each time I was more myself." He closed the notebook and placed it beside him. The moon was full, its light soft against the world. From the street below came the soft clatter of hooves, the laughter of a couple returning home, the quiet bark of a dog settling in for the night. Matteo leaned back, resting his head against the wall, and let his eyes close. He was not thinking of Venice, not of trade, not of where the road would lead next. He was thinking of stillness, of breath, of the simple, sacred act of being. And there, under the vast sky, in a city born of crossroads and quiet wisdom, Matteo slept. No longer a merchant in search of something, but a man who had finally learned how to arrive. And so, the long road of our Venetian merchant gently comes to a close. His footsteps fade into the quiet streets of Samarkand, and the pages of his notebook now rest still. Before we move on to our next story, if this peaceful journey brought you calm, I'd be grateful if you gave this video a gentle like, and perhaps subscribe to the channel. Your quiet support helps us bring you more restful nights. Now, let's continue our sleepy series with a new story. This time, we travel into a different kind of beauty, the gardens of ancient Persia. Before the rise of Rome, and long before the palaces of Versailles would draw the eyes of Europe, there existed a quieter, more enduring beauty, one shaped not by conquest, but by water, light, and the rhythm of the natural world. It was the garden. And in the heart of ancient Persia, the garden was more than a place. It was a philosophy, a reflection of paradise, a mirror of the universe. The Persians called it peridesa, meaning a walled enclosure, which in time would become the root of the word paradise itself. But these gardens were not escapes from the world. They were the world refined, ordered, harmonized, designed to bring balance between man and nature. Our story begins not with a king, nor a battlefield, but with the sound of water, a slow, soft stream running through a narrow channel carved with care. The sound echoed gently through the walls of Pasargadae, one of the earliest capitals of the Achaemenid Empire, where Cyrus the Great walked among his orchards. This was no mere retreat. The garden was a space of meaning. Trees were planted with intention, pomegranates, dates, and figs. Paths were arranged in 4 symmetrical quadrants, each representing a part of the cosmos: earth, water, air, and fire. This layout would be known as the Chahar Bagh, the fourfold garden, and it would echo across centuries, copied from Delhi to Granada, Istanbul to Isfahan. In the Persian mind, the garden was not only a pleasure ground, but a place of contemplation. A king could rule from his throne, but to understand the deeper order of things, he would sit in his garden and listen to the wind through the cypress trees, to the birds that nested among jasmine vines, to the sound of water flowing steadily from one pool to the next. It was believed that flowing water, AB, carried purity and life. The engineers of Persia, skilled in the art of qanats, brought water from underground aquifers miles away, gently sloping tunnels built by hand. It was this mastery of hidden water that made the Persian garden possible even in arid land. Water was channeled to feed fountains and moats, to fill square basins lined with smooth stone, and to nourish rose bushes that bloomed even under the desert sun. The contrast of elements, green against dry, shade against heat, order against wildness, was deliberate. The garden was a microcosm of balance. One might walk its paths at sunrise, as dew clung to the petals of tulips, and feel the world settle into place. In this quiet harmony, there was space for reflection, for poetry, for thought. And it is no coincidence that so many Persian poets, from Ferdowsi to Hafez, found their verses shaped by gardens. They did not merely write in them, they wrote like them, in lines that flowed like water, in metaphors that bloomed like roses, in wisdom that grew slowly, patiently, rooted in the soil of silence. It is said that Cyrus himself once walked barefoot through his garden. His generals puzzled at his stillness. When asked why he did not speak, he replied, "The garden speaks, I am listening." Later kings expanded upon his vision. In Susa, Darius planted cedar trees from Lebanon, vines from Armenia, and lilies from the Indus Valley. He believed the garden was a map of his empire, not in roads and borders, but in scents and shapes. A flower from each land under his rule, a tree from every province. To walk through it was to walk across the empire, peacefully, no armies, no commands, only the language of water and bloom. These gardens were enclosed by high walls, not to shut the world out, but to hold the world in balance, to remind those inside that beauty could be created, not just inherited. That stillness was a kind of power. That shade could teach as much as sunlight. And so the Persian garden became an enduring symbol, not of escape, but of integration, where the human hand worked with the earth, not against it, where kings humbled themselves before the quiet wisdom of trees, where time seemed to pause long enough for thought to deepen, for spirit to settle. And though the empires would rise and fall and cities would crumble into dust, the idea of the garden remained, passed on, replanted, echoed like a seed carried on the wind. And tonight, perhaps, as you close your eyes and slow your breath, you too are walking a path between rows of cypress and rose. You too are listening to the sound of water trickling over smooth stones. You too are entering a quiet, ancient paradise, not far away but within. As time moved forward, the Persian garden did not fade. It grew like the trees planted within its walls, rooted in ancient thought, yet reaching toward the future. After the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, new dynasties rose, each leaving their own quiet signature on the soil. The Sassanids came, followed by the Seljuks, the Timurids, the Safavids, and with each wave of rule, the garden remained, not just as a space, but as a language of beauty and wisdom that transcended politics and conquest. It was during the Timurid period, particularly under the rule of Shah Timur's descendants in the 14th and 15th centuries, that the Persian garden reached new heights, not only in scale, but in symbolism. In the city of Herat, and later in Samarkand, the gardens became vast, carefully engineered spaces with terraces, aqueducts, marble walkways, and domed pavilions designed not to impress through size, but to soothe through order. These were gardens meant to mirror the celestial order. The alignment of their paths echoed the movement of the stars. Pools were placed with precision to reflect the sky above, a reminder that heaven and earth were not separate, but joined in still water. One could stand beneath a fig tree, its leaves fluttering in the morning breeze, and see both branches above and their mirrored image below. In this doubled world, one began to understand the deeper truths, the balance of opposites, the union of form and emptiness. The gardens were built upon layers of meaning. The number 4, repeated in quadrants, symbolized the 4 Zoroastrian elements: earth, water, fire, and air. 8-sided fountains echoed the 8 gates of paradise. Walls were not built merely to divide, but to create sanctuary, to frame the sky in ways that invited contemplation. Shade was considered sacred. A well-placed tree could do more than cool the air. It could soften the soul. Even the fragrance of each flower was chosen with purpose. Jasmine to calm the nerves, roses to open the heart, cypress to remind the viewer of eternity. Its tall, narrow form pointing always skyward, unbending. And in the center of many gardens stood a pavilion or a small open structure, not for ceremony, but for presence. Here, poets composed verses, scholars debated softly, and travelers, weary from the road, were offered tea and stillness. The garden did not demand attention, it invited surrender. Among the most iconic of these spaces was the Garden of Fin in Kashan, built during the Safavid era, but rooted in earlier design. Its long pools fed by natural springs, its walkways lined with plane trees, and its central courtyard, where the sound of water echoed like soft bells, made it a living manuscript of Persian philosophy. The walls enclosed the space, yet the sky above remained open, reminding visitors that even within structure, freedom could flourish. But it was not only kings and nobles who understood the sacredness of these places. Farmers mimicked the garden's balance in the way they planted their fields. Craftsmen carved garden scenes into tile and wood. Women grew their own private gardens behind simple homes, placing pots of basil and mint in carefully arranged corners, teaching their children to water not only with their hands, but with attention. Poetry, too, carried the garden's wisdom across generations. In the lines of Hafez, we read of roses and nightingales not just as symbols of love, but as reminders of presence, of fleeting beauty, of the way longing itself can be sacred. Rumi spoke of the garden within the heart, that still, green place where the soul could rest beneath the branches of truth. And Omar Khayyam, with his verses about wine and blossoms, reminded us that paradise was not something to wait for after death. It could be touched, even briefly, in the shared silence of a blooming garden. The Persian garden was, and still is, a place of return. Not return to a specific location, but to a way of seeing, a way of being. It teaches that time moves in cycles, like the seasons, that beauty need not shout to be profound, that peace, true peace, begins with balance. As you imagine yourself now, walking along a shaded path, hearing the slow trickle of water nearby, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, perhaps you begin to feel it too, that quiet remembering, that gentle pause, that sense that even in the stillest places, something sacred is always growing, and the garden waits, not to be conquered, not to be explained, but simply to be entered, again and again, like a breath returning home. To understand the soul of the Persian garden, one must not only walk its paths or admire its structure, but also step into its silence. This silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper, a quiet that invites reflection, a hush that seems to echo with the wisdom of centuries. The gardens of ancient Persia were designed not just as places to admire beauty, but as sanctuaries for thought. They were, in essence, open-air philosophies, teaching through texture, through symmetry, through scent. In the shade of a fruit tree, one could study the nature of patience. In the cool arc of a marble channel, one might learn about flow, about letting go. As rulers changed and dynasties shifted, the garden remained a constant. It became not only a place of rest, but a symbol of continuity in a land where politics and empires could rise and fall like waves. Through the Sassanid era and into the Islamic Golden Age, the garden took on new layers of meaning. It became a meeting place between Persian tradition and Islamic cosmology. The Quran itself describes paradise as a garden beneath which rivers flow, and so the Persian garden became a living metaphor for the divine. These gardens were designed with incredible intention. The walls, the channels, the trees, the placement of each flowering bush, all served a purpose greater than aesthetics. Even the sound of water was shaped carefully. Engineers arranged fountains and channels so that the water would ripple gently, a soothing, rhythmic sound that seemed to match the heartbeat of the earth. In some gardens, particularly those surrounding madrasas and places of learning, the water's movement was aligned with the acoustics of nearby rooms, creating an ambient hum that helped scholars concentrate, pray, and breathe in rhythm with the world. The Persian garden was also a memory keeper. Within its walls were echoes of stories, lovers who met beneath the fig trees, sages who taught beside still pools, travelers who washed the dust of the road from their hands and faces, and found not just cleanliness, but clarity. Often, gardens were commissioned not for glory, but for mourning. A father might build one in memory of a lost child. A king might have one planted for his mother. And within that space, grief was not pushed away, but held. Wrapped in rose petals, softened by shade, given space to become something else. Even now, one can walk the ruins of an old Persian garden and feel that softness. The trees may be gone, the water may have stopped flowing, but the stones remember. The layout remains. The language of the garden is not easily forgotten. And then there was the element of light. Unlike the blinding sun of the open desert, the Persian garden filtered light through trees, through lattice screens, through the glint of water. Light became a teacher. It revealed slowly. It touched without burning. Morning light cast long shadows across tiled walkways, Noonlight shimmered on the surface of still pools, creating soft patterns on nearby walls. Evening light, golden and low, turned even the simplest flower into something sacred. And in that light, the viewer changed. To sit quietly beneath a pomegranate tree, watching a butterfly land and take flight, was to experience something beyond time. To watch a single leaf float across the surface of a pool was to be reminded of the impermanence of all things. These moments did not shout, they whispered, and those who listened walked away with something they could not always explain, something softer, something more whole. The garden was also a space of hospitality. It welcomed without judgment. A guest, whether prince or poet, was offered the same tea, the same shade, the same breeze. And within those walls, titles disappeared. All were simply human, tired perhaps, curious, longing for peace. The garden did not ask why one had come. It only opened itself, like a rose in the morning, and waited. And so it remains, this Persian gift to the world, a pattern of paths and pools, of fragrance and form, of sacred silence held in stone and soil. Even today, across Iran and beyond, these gardens continue. They are not relics, they are invitations to slow down, to breathe, to listen. And as you drift now into your own stillness, perhaps you can feel it, that same ancient hush, that breath of jasmine, that trickle of water, that memory of paradise, gently blooming within you. In the heart of every Persian garden lies a secret not carved in stone or planted in soil, but carried in the quiet space between things. A pause between footsteps, a breeze that lingers a moment longer than expected, a shadow that dances on the edge of light. These gardens were not built only for the eye, they were constructed for the spirit, measured in stillness, framed by patience, shaped by an understanding that true beauty does not demand attention. It reveals itself slowly, as trust does, with time. The deeper one wandered into a Persian garden, the more one realized that it was never meant to be crossed quickly. The paths did not rush from one point to the next. They meandered softly, they invited wandering. They encouraged one to lose track of destination and begin noticing the moments between arrival and departure. A single drop of water falling into a pool, the soft murmur of wind moving through plane trees, the rustle of a bird in a distant fig branch. These sounds formed the music of the garden, and in this music, people found peace. Over time, the Persian garden influenced lands far beyond its borders. As trade routes connected cultures, the ideas carried in its design traveled too. Mughal India, inspired by Persian architects, began to craft grand Chaharbagh layouts, four-part gardens with central water channels and symmetrical reflection pools. The tomb of Humayun in Delhi, and later the famous Taj Mahal, were both framed by Persian garden design, blending spiritual symbolism with geometric precision. The idea was not merely to build a beautiful place, it was to create a mirror of harmony, an echo of divine order. In Islamic Spain, the Alhambra's Court of the Lions and the Generalife Gardens carried Persian echoes, with fountains designed to whisper and tiled channels that cooled the air and the soul. Even as far west as Moorish Morocco, the walled riads with their citrus trees and central courtyards bore the fingerprints of ancient Persia. These were not imitations, they were conversations. New cultures speaking the language of peace through paths and petals and water. In each translation, the essence remained: a refuge from noise, a space for balance, and a connection to something greater than the self. The Persian garden also served as a record of knowledge. Plants were not chosen at random. They were selected with purpose. Medicinal herbs, edible fruits, fragrant blossoms, and symbolic trees. Each one carried a story. The pomegranate was a symbol of abundance, the cypress of eternity, the rose of love, and the humble basil plant, crushed between fingers, offered calm to the mind and relief to the body. Scholars wrote of these plants in treatises that were passed from generation to generation. Physicians would walk the gardens not only to clear their minds, but to gather ingredients. Philosophers sat under almond trees and composed texts about harmony and justice. Artists used the layout of the garden to inform the designs of carpets, manuscript borders, and architectural motifs. Everything was connected. The garden was both inspiration and instruction. Even the act of tending a garden became spiritual. Gardeners, often anonymous and rarely mentioned in royal chronicles, were the quiet caretakers of paradise. Their work was slow, their days long, yet they moved with a kind of reverence. To prune a tree, to sweep a path, to adjust a stone in a water channel, these were not chores. These were acts of devotion. It was said that a well-kept garden reflected the soul of its keeper. And so, within the shade of fruit-bearing trees and along the edges of reflecting pools, there bloomed not only flowers, but character. One could learn the value of gentleness from a petal, the necessity of timing from the ripening of fruit, the wisdom of humility from the slow work of soil and water. In the poetry of Sati, we read of kings and beggars walking side by side in the same garden, both made equal beneath the branches. And in that equality, truth emerged, not shouted, but felt. A truth that did not belong to any one ruler or people, but to all who paused long enough to notice it. Today, though centuries have passed, and borders have shifted, and empires have turned to dust, the Persian garden remains. In cities like Shiraz and Yazd, in the echoes of Hafez's verses, in the perfume of roses pressed into old books, in the way a stone basin catches the morning light, it continues, waiting, teaching, breathing, not in haste, but in quiet, eternal rhythm. And perhaps, as your eyes grow heavier and your thoughts slow like the turning of soft wind through cypress leaves, you too can feel that rhythm, that ancient peace, that garden within. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the world is not yet awake but no longer asleep, there exists a hush, a gentle stillness that carries something ancient in its silence. It is in this space that the spirit of the Persian garden comes alive most clearly, not as a physical place, but as a memory of balance, a trace of sacred order, a breath that echoes from soil to soul. For those who walked its paths centuries ago, the Persian garden was not simply a destination. It was a return to a state of calm, a return to the rhythm of nature, a return to the self. Even in times of war, of upheaval, of uncertainty, the garden remained untouched in purpose. It was the pause in the middle of movement, the shade in the center of fire, the silence beneath the noise of the world. In these spaces, kings found clarity, poets found metaphors, and ordinary people found themselves. The design of the garden continued to evolve with each passing dynasty. Under the Safavids, especially in the city of Isfahan, garden design became more refined, more deliberate. The lines between art, architecture, and landscape blurred until the garden became not just a backdrop, but the very canvas on which life unfolded. The great boulevards of Isfahan, shaded with rows of poplars, led to central garden spaces where water danced in tiled fountains and light poured through carved lattice windows. Palaces like Chehel Sotun, meaning 40 columns, stood at the edge of mirrored pools so still, so precise, that the reflection of the palace seemed to double its height. In the garden, reflection was not just visual, it was inward. And those who sat beside those waters did not merely see, they considered, they remembered, they dreamed. These royal gardens were not closed to the people. On certain days, they opened their gates and allowed citizens to wander through the perfumed paths. Sellers of sweets and poets with soft voices mingled with travelers, all sharing the same shade, the same sound of flowing water. The garden belonged to no one, and to everyone. Within its walls, time softened, conversation slowed, and the air itself seemed to carry fewer demands. There was space between things, between words, between thoughts, between breaths. And it was within this space that insight could arrive, not forced, not summoned, just quietly appearing like a blossom unfolding at first light. In smaller towns, gardens took simpler forms: walled courtyards with a central pool, narrow canals feeding orange trees, vines curling gently up whitewashed walls. Families would gather in these spaces not to impress, but to be close. Grandmothers told stories beneath apricot trees. Children played with shadows cast by trellises. A father might nap with a book open on his chest, the sound of sparrows and rustling leaves acting as a lullaby. The garden was a place to live slowly. And in that slowness, life revealed its depth. Even in the hottest months, when the sun pressed heavily upon the land, the garden remained cool, not through magic, but through understanding. An understanding of how wind moved, how water behaved, how shade fell. Walls were built thick to hold the coolness of night. Trees were placed to direct the breeze. Water channels ran slightly below ground level so that the earth itself helped to preserve freshness. This was not engineering for the sake of control. It was harmony, the result of listening to the land, of working with it, not against it. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of the Persian garden, that peace is not something built in haste. It is cultivated, slowly, with attention, with humility, with love. In a garden, one does not rush. One watches, one waits, one learns. And slowly, without force, beauty rises. Not in grand gestures, but in the curve of a branch, the arc of a pathway, the dance of light on water. Tonight, as you settle into stillness, you may begin to feel the garden within you. You may find yourself beneath the soft shade of a tree you do not remember planting. You may hear the faint trickle of water like a forgotten memory gently returning. And you may understand, without needing words, that you are home, that this quiet, ancient peace has been waiting for you all along, in the silence, in the stillness, in the garden of your own soul. As the centuries moved gently forward, the Persian garden continued to evolve, not with sudden change, but like the shifting of light through branches, slow and almost imperceptible. What began as sacred enclosures of water and shade in the heart of empires gradually became quiet sanctuaries for poets, philosophers, and everyday people who sought more than shelter. They sought a return to simplicity, to the soul, to something ancient and steady. The Qajar era saw a time of transition. Persia, facing the tremors of the modern world, still held tightly to the garden tradition. In cities like Tehran and Shiraz, the balance between modernity and memory became visible in the way gardens were preserved, expanded, and lived in. These were no longer simply royal grounds or elite retreats. They became part of daily life, woven into the neighborhoods, into the routines of afternoon tea, into the silences between the calls to prayer. In this time, garden walls were built around private homes, sometimes modest, sometimes grand, but always with care. The inner courtyard became a stage for everyday rituals, sweeping the stone path in the early morning while birds gathered in the trees, watering herbs in clay pots with fingers as gentle as rain, sitting in the cool of evening with a bowl of fruit and the sound of distant water flowing nearby. Life did not rush in these spaces. It unfolded. In the great garden of Aram in Shiraz, perhaps the most famous surviving Persian garden, tall cypress trees rise like sentinels around fountains and terraces. The fragrance of orange blossoms floats across air so still it seems to hum. It is said that Hafez himself wandered here, composing lines not from invention, but from listening to the garden speak in its own quiet grammar, a grammar of balance, a language of pause. Even today, to walk through Aram is to enter not just a garden, but a mood, a softened state of being. Students walk slowly, elders pause to rest on marble benches, lovers speak in whispers. No one runs, no one shouts. It is not a rule, but a response. The garden slows you, without effort, without force. And that is its power. In Yazd, where the desert presses close and heat is part of daily life, the Persian garden takes on an even more miraculous presence. Here, the use of water is an art form born of survival. Wind towers rise like chimneys from traditional homes, catching breezes and guiding them through shaded rooms and courtyards where water lies in long, narrow pools. The result is a kind of natural air conditioning, a breath of coolness that surprises and soothes. In this place, the garden is not an ornament. It is essential, a testimony to human ingenuity, yes, but more than that, a symbol of humility, a reminder that we do not master nature by conquering it, but by listening to it. The builders of these gardens knew that the land held secrets, that water could be persuaded, but never commanded, that shade could be designed, but not imposed. And so they worked not with dominance, but with devotion, and their reward was peace. Lasting peace, generational peace. Even as concrete cities rose and satellite dishes bloomed on rooftops, the garden endured. It adapted. In smaller forms, perhaps, with fewer fountains or simpler paths, but always with the same intent, to offer space, to offer calm, to remind. And what is it reminding us of? That time is not always measured in hours, that beauty can be quiet, that harmony is not always a grand design, but sometimes the gentle placing of a stone, the trimming of a vine, the way a bench is angled toward the breeze. In a Persian garden, you do not escape life, you meet it, in its softest form. You walk among trees planted by those who came before. You rest beside pools that reflected the same stars centuries ago, and you begin to feel that you are not alone, not in your seeking, not in your silence, not in your longing for something that cannot be named. Perhaps that is why the garden still draws us, even now. In a world of noise, it offers hush. In a world of speed, it offers slowness. And in a world of constant change, it offers something steady, eternal. Tonight, as you breathe softly and let your thoughts drift like petals on still water, imagine yourself once more in that timeless space. The path beneath your feet is cool. The leaves overhead are rustling with the breeze. And somewhere nearby, a fountain sings in a voice older than memory. You are not lost, you are simply returning. Returning to balance, to beauty, to the garden. In the lingering hush of early evening, when the air cools and the sky softens into amber, the Persian garden becomes something else entirely. Not merely a place of trees and water, but a quiet threshold between the visible and the unseen. As the sun dips behind the walls and shadows stretch long across the tiled walkways, something sacred begins to unfold. Not in spectacle, but in the way the garden holds space, for thought, for silence, for the gentle fading of the day. The evening was always a cherished time in Persian gardens. Families would gather on soft rugs spread over stone, sipping sweet tea and listening to the murmur of water as the last birds called from the fig trees. Lamps, simple and low, would be lit just enough to reflect in the pools, doubling the stars above with stars below. And in that mirrored world between heaven and earth, stories were told. Generations passed down not only knowledge, but wonder. Tales of ancient kings who built palaces with rooms of glass and silver, of Sufi mystics who wandered the gardens barefoot, listening to the silence between each leaf's fall, of lovers who left letters beneath rose bushes, trusting the petals to protect their secrets. These stories lived not in books, but in the air, in the spaces between jasmine vines and the soft creak of wooden doors left slightly ajar. The garden listened and remembered. Over time, the memory of these spaces began to take root in the Persian imagination, not only as physical locations, but as internal landscapes. The garden was no longer only something to walk through, but something to carry within, a mental refuge, a spiritual posture, a way of seeing the world. Architects began designing not just courtyards and groves, but entire cities with garden principles at their core. The layout of neighborhoods, the flow of streets, the positioning of public baths, libraries, and prayer halls all took cues from the garden. The idea was simple but profound. If a garden could bring harmony to a piece of land, then perhaps the same harmony could extend into society itself. Order without rigidity, beauty without excess, flow without chaos. This principle was visible in every tile, every wall, every softly arched entrance that framed a view of water or sky. The garden's geometry was not meant to impress with precision, but to remind the viewer that harmony has shape. That symmetry is not just a mathematical idea, but a spiritual one. It invites us to find balance not only in the world, but in ourselves. A balanced path, a centered mind, a still heart. Persian poets and philosophers carried this idea forward. They often spoke of gardens when describing the human soul. In their verses, the heart became a walled garden. The breath became a flowing stream. The mind became a tree that must be pruned to bear fruit. This metaphor extended even into moments of grief. In times of sorrow, people were reminded to return to their inner garden, to water it with tears, to tend it with patience, to let new blooms arise in their own time. And so the garden became a tool for healing, a quiet space where pain could soften, where joy could root itself again, slowly, gently, without rush. It offered more than rest. It offered restoration. Even in exile, Persian travelers recreated small gardens as wherever they settled. A single rose in a pot, a narrow strip of water channeled through stone, a few herbs by a window. These were more than comforts. They were connections to home, to memory, to meaning. A way of saying, even in a strange land, that paradise could still be found in small things. A few centuries later, as European travelers made their way through Persia and beyond, they wrote extensively about these gardens in their journals. They marveled at their elegance, but more often they were struck by their quiet. Unlike the structured formality of European courts or the manicured vastness of estate grounds, Persian gardens held a kind of softness, a deliberate gentleness that seemed to slow the entire world. Some visitors described them as dreamlike, others as philosophical. A few said they felt as if the garden was not a place to visit, but a place that visited you, that opened its arms slowly, that asked nothing, that gave everything. And so the Persian garden remained, not frozen in time, but alive in essence. Even now, in the gentle rustle of a vine against a clay wall, in the sound of water echoing down a narrow channel, in the hush that arrives just after sunset, we can feel it, that ancient longing, that quiet wisdom, that invitation to remember who we are when the world goes still. As you breathe in now, soft and slow, imagine the sky above you turning blue to silver. Imagine the scent of night-blooming flowers. Imagine the garden waiting, not far away, but within. As night fully settles over the Persian garden, the stars above flicker gently, mirrored in the stillness of the water below. The hush deepens. The warmth of the day dissolves into the cool breath of evening, and the garden, always alive, begins to shift once more. Its sounds change. The rustling of leaves softens. The bubbling of fountains slows in the mind, like the beating of a tired heart at rest. It is in this quiet hour, between the last sip of tea and the first dreams of sleep, that the garden offers its deepest wisdom, not through explanation, but through presence. For centuries, Persians believed that the garden held a kind of knowledge not taught in books, an understanding that could only be absorbed by being still. Not everything, they said, was meant to be solved. Some things were simply meant to be witnessed: a leaf falling, a flower closing, a ripple spreading from the drop of a single petal. These were not distractions, they were invitations to look deeper, to return inward, to remember that life, like the garden, was not always about progress. Sometimes it was about rest and reflection and the quiet blooming of something unseen. Among the most beloved elements of the Persian garden was its use of light at night. Lanterns, whether hung in trees or resting beside low walls, were never overly bright. Their glow was modest, like fireflies guarding the edge of a dream. They lit just enough to guide a path, to draw the eye toward a fountain, to silhouette the branches of a pomegranate tree swaying gently in the breeze. In these dim pools of light, stories were told not with voices, but with gestures. A hand reaching for another, a head resting on a lap, a breath released. Peace was not a goal. It was a shared moment, a silence held between two people who did not need words. In some gardens, music would rise softly in the evenings, played not on grand instruments, but on flutes, on zithers, on the soft tapping of fingers against clay drums. The melodies did not fill the space. They moved through it, weaving around columns, floating through vines, wrapping around the listener like a lullaby. And when the music stopped, the silence did not feel empty. It felt complete, balanced, whole. In the Sufi tradition, the garden was seen not just as paradise on earth, but as a symbol of the journey of the soul. The outer walls represented the boundaries of the self, the entrance gate, the moment of awakening, the paths, the trials of life, the water channels, the rivers of divine truth, and the central pavilion, the place of union with the eternal. To walk the garden was to walk toward God, toward love, toward understanding, each step a meditation, each turn a surrender. In this way, the garden was a teacher, a silent guide for the weary, a gentle reminder that the path to peace is not somewhere far away. It begins here, beneath your feet, in the earth, in the air, in the rhythm of the water that flows not with force, but with trust. Many believe that even the plants themselves whispered prayers, that a rose blooming in silence could offer more wisdom than 1,000 voices shouting, that a cypress, tall and still, could teach resilience better than any sermon, that the fragrance of a single orange blossom at dusk could bring a man to tears, not from sadness, but from the sheer beauty of existence. These gardens were not grand in the way of monuments. They did not seek attention. They did not command. They welcomed. They softened. They healed. A traveler arriving after a long journey would find not a banner, not applause, but a cup of cool water and a shaded bench, a place to sit, to breathe, to feel his own weight again. And slowly, like a stone warming in the sun, the traveler would begin to return to himself. No one asked where he had come from. The garden did not care. Only that he was here now, present, listening. The garden asked for nothing, but gave endlessly. Stillness, shelter, understanding. Tonight, as your eyes begin to close and your breath settles into a softer rhythm, you too are arriving. Not in a place made of walls and soil, but in a space within yourself. A garden made of memory, of peace, of quiet truths that do not fade. The air is cool, the water glimmers faintly beneath the stars, and you, like every seeker before you, are simply here, listening, breathing, belonging. As morning begins to return, slow and golden on the horizon, the Persian garden greets it not with fanfare, but with a soft unfolding. The petals of night-blooming flowers close gently, as if sighing back into sleep. The leaves shimmer with the light touch of dew. Birds begin to stir, not all at once, but in slow chorus, one call answered by another, as if testing the day's intention. And in the stillness before full light, the garden seems to stretch its limbs, quietly waking after a long and peaceful dream. In this moment, the garden does not rush to open. It waits, it listens, it breathes. And through this unhurried rhythm, it teaches once more how to begin without haste, how to move forward with grace. Ancient caretakers of Persian gardens believed that dawn was sacred, not only because it marked the return of light, but because it reminded all living things of renewal, to rise not with force, but with gentleness, to greet the new with reverence. In many homes, the first act of the day was to walk into the courtyard barefoot, letting the coolness of the tiles or the softness of the grass ground the body and clear the mind. The garden was both sanctuary and compass, a reminder that peace begins not with words, but with presence. Water was often drawn then, not only to nourish the plants, but to cleanse the space spiritually. The sprinkling of fresh water across the paths was a ritual of respect, of readiness, a way of preparing the earth and the self for whatever the day might bring. Even those who did not speak of prayer understood this as devotion, a quiet honoring of the life around them. The garden, after all, was not something separate from the world. It was the world in balance, a reflection of what could be when care met beauty, when silence met structure, when nature met intention. And so each day, the garden renewed its offering: shade for the weary, fragrance for the breathless, space for those carrying too much. In its symmetry, the mind found order. In its stillness, the heart found rhythm. In its gentle design, the soul found clarity. One did not need to understand architecture to feel this. It was felt in the bones, in the slowing of thought, in the way the shoulders dropped when one passed beneath the arch of a vine-covered trellis, in the way time seemed to shift, not stopping but softening, as if each moment had been stretched just enough to hold peace. This too was the gift of the garden, not just the beauty of its trees or the intricacy of its tiles, but the spaciousness it offered to those within it. A spaciousness that did not demand, that did not judge, that simply held. In some traditions, it was believed that each person carried a garden within them, a private, hidden space where thoughts grew and feelings ripened. And just as a real garden required tending, watering, pruning, care, so too did the inner world. Neglect it, and weeds of worry might spread. Starve it, and joy might wilt. But give it time, light and kindness, and even the most barren soil could bloom again. The outer garden, then, was not just a place of beauty. It was a teacher, a mirror, a gentle partner in the lifelong work of self-cultivation. And perhaps this is why the garden endures, not as a relic, but as a living metaphor. Even in modern cities, even among noise and speed and distraction, the idea of the Persian garden survives. In a small potted plant on a windowsill, in the sound of a tiny fountain beside a busy street, in a bench tucked beneath a tree where someone sits, alone, reading, breathing. The garden continues, not always in its full form, but in essence, in fragments, in memory, in longing. And so, even if we are far from the tiled paths and tall cypress trees, we can still return. Not with our feet, but with our minds, with our breath. with the closing of our eyes and the softening of our thoughts. For the garden waits, not as a place, but as a way of being. A reminder that rest is not a luxury, it is a rhythm. That peace is not found outside of us, it is grown. And tonight, or in this quiet hour of early light, as your mind drifts gently between thought and stillness, you are once again in the garden, walking slowly, breathing deeply, listening not for answers, but for the soft language of presence, the rustle of leaves, the echo of water, the hush of morning. And within that hush, the simple sacred truth, you are already home. And so, in the quiet rhythm of water and wind, in the shade of old cypress trees, and the glow of soft lantern light, we reach the final chapter of the garden. Not as an ending, but as a return, a gentle circling back to where it all began. Not with walls or fountains or flowers, but with intention, with the simple sacred wish to create a space where the soul could rest. The Persian garden was never meant to overwhelm. Its beauty was not loud. Its paths did not demand to be followed in order. Its pools did not ask for admiration. Everything in it whispered. Everything waited. The garden did not call attention to itself. It allowed you to disappear into it, to forget the burdens you carried and remember something quieter, older, and more essential. Even today, those who visit the great gardens of Iran speak less about what they saw and more about how they felt. A sense of weightlessness, a slowing of breath, a feeling of being held. Not by walls or trees, but by time itself. It is this feeling that has endured across centuries, cultures, and continents. Because while empires rise and fall, and cities change shape, the longing for stillness does not fade. The need for beauty that heals, for space that listens, remains. In this way, the Persian garden became not only a place, but a gift, passed down through generations not just in stone and soil, but in memory, in story, in practice. A shared ritual of care, a way of tending not just to land, but to life. Architects still study its proportions. Poets still borrow its metaphors. Designers still echo its principles in homes, parks, and courtyards around the world. But the truest legacy of the garden is not in what was built, but in what was remembered. In the way a visitor might return home and plant a small fig tree. In the way a grandmother waters her mint with the same quiet attention her mother did. In the way a child learns to pause beside a stream, just to listen. These are not grand gestures, they are soft, ordinary acts, but they carry within them the essence of paradise. Not the paradise of golden gates, but the paradise of breath, of light, of slowness. This the Persians understood, that heaven is not above or after. It is here, in the way we shape space with care, in the way we welcome silence, in the way we offer peace without condition. The garden, at its heart, was always about this, an offering. A space that gives without asking, a space that holds without clinging, a space that reminds us that beauty is not something we must chase, but something we can grow, slowly, gently, day by day. And so now, as our journey through the gardens of ancient Persia draws to a close, you may find that you carry a little of that garden within you, not as a memory, but as a presence. Perhaps you feel it in your breath, deeper, slower, more rooted. Perhaps you feel it in your thoughts, less tangled, more open. Perhaps you feel it in the simple quiet that now surrounds you. The garden has never been far. Even if your world is full of noise, even if the days move too fast, even if there is no cypress or pool in sight, you can still return. With a breath, with a pause, with the closing of your eyes and the soft remembering of what it feels like to walk where the earth has been shaped with love. You return not by going anywhere, but by becoming still, by listening, by resting. And in that resting, something returns to you, a calmness, a clarity, a deep and gentle peace. So tonight, as you drift further into sleep, you are not leaving the garden. You are simply entering it more deeply. The sky above is full of stars, mirrored softly in the waters below. The air carries the faint scent of orange blossoms. The stone beneath you holds the warmth of the day. There is nothing to do, nothing to fix, nothing to prove. Only this, only now, only the slow, sacred breath of a garden that has waited lifetimes for your arrival. Welcome home. And so, our journey through the quiet, sacred beauty of the Persian garden comes to an end. Its paths may fade, but its stillness stays with us. Before we begin our next sleepy tale, if this story has brought you peace tonight, I would be grateful if you gave it a soft like. And if you enjoy these gentle journeys, please consider subscribing. Your quiet support helps keep this garden of stories growing. Now close your eyes once more, and let's continue our series of boring history for sleep, as we ride beneath open skies and windswept plains into the vast communication network of a rising empire, the imperial post of the Mongol Empire. In the vast silence of the Central Asian steppe, where the wind stretches like an unseen tide across endless plains, a single rider appears on the horizon. His silhouette is small against the immensity of land and sky, but his purpose is clear, his pace steady. This rider does not stop to admire the sunrise blooming behind him, or the golden grasses shifting like waves under his horse's hooves. He is part of something larger, something quiet and powerful, the pulse of an empire carried not by armies or banners, but by speed, by communication, by the invisible threads of a system known as the YAM, the imperial postal network of the Mongol Empire. This is not the part of Mongol history most often remembered. When people speak of the Mongols, they recall the conquests, the sieges, the thunder of hooves, and the fall of cities. But behind that thunder came something softer, and perhaps more lasting. A web of roads, stations, and riders that bound together the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. It was not just a courier service. It was the nervous system of a civilization in motion. It connected the court of the Great Khan in Karakoram to the farthest reaches of the empire, from the Yellow River to the Black Sea, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the mountains of Persia. Through it, messages traveled faster than any news had ever moved across such distances. And all of it was possible because of one simple principle: preparation. Every 30 to 40 kilometers, a relay station, known as an urtu, was placed along major routes. These stations were stocked with fresh horses, food, water, and shelter. The riders, known as yam couriers, could arrive, exchange their tired horse for a fresh one, rest only moments, and then ride on again. In this way, a message could cover hundreds of kilometers in a single day, far surpassing any previous system known to the world. These couriers were not mere messengers. They were trained for endurance, for clarity, for survival. They carried with them tablets known as paisa, inscribed with official markings that granted them access to the resources of the empire. With this, they could demand fresh horses, requisition supplies, and pass freely through guarded territories. Few dared interfere with them. To obstruct a yam courier was to obstruct the will of the Khan himself. But the network was not only for military orders or royal commands. It also carried administrative reports, tax information, census data, and news from one province to another. It allowed the empire to remain aware of itself, to see its own shape, to feel its own edges. Traders, scholars, and ambassadors also used the yam. It became a lifeline for the Silk Road, supporting the movement of people, ideas, and goods with stability the region had never known. A merchant leaving Samarkand could send word to a partner in Beijing and expect an answer within weeks, not seasons. This flow of communication gave rise to something rare in history: an empire vast enough to stretch across continents, yet agile enough to respond with precision. At the heart of it all was a belief held by Genghis Khan himself, that information was power, but only if it moved. And so he built the system not as an afterthought, but as a foundation. Long before the Mongols built cities, they built routes. Long before they ruled courts, they ruled roads. The design of the yam reflected the Mongol way of thinking: practical, flexible, and deeply in tune with geography. The stations were simple, often just felt tents and corrals, but always located with care. They avoided marshes, climbed mountain passes when needed, and followed the rhythms of the land. They did not fight against the environment, they flowed with it. And in doing so, they created a network that breathed with the empire itself. Even in winter, when snow buried the roads and rivers froze, the couriers continued. Wrapped in furs, navigating by memory and instinct, they crossed white plains under gray skies, carrying in their saddlebags the thoughts of rulers, the plans of generals, the hopes of faraway families. And as they rode through wind and time, they did more than deliver messages. They shaped history. For without the yam, the Mongol Empire would have been scattered noise. It was this quiet, relentless system of connection that made the Mongol world feel like a single beating heart. And tonight, as you lie still and the noise of your own day begins to fade, imagine that lone rider again, moving beneath an endless sky, carrying not only the weight of a message, but the stillness of purpose. The hooves of his horse tap out a soft rhythm across the steppe. The wind carries no sound but his breath. The world around him is vast, but he is not lost. He is part of something whole, something that moves not with noise, but with meaning. The Yam system, vast and invisible like veins beneath the skin of an empire, was not only a logistical marvel, it was a reflection of Mongol philosophy. In a world often measured by walls and fortresses, the Mongols chose instead to build paths. Where other empires used distance to divide, they used it to connect. And every route, every station, every change of horse was part of a larger pattern, one not just of efficiency, but of trust. At the heart of this trust was the paisa, a small but powerful object that each courier carried, shaped like a tablet, often of gold or silver depending on rank, and engraved with official seals. The paisa served not only as identification, but as a key. It opened doors, unlocked resources, and served as a silent envoy of the great Khan himself. If a rider presented his paisa at a household or a village or a station, there was no debate. He was fed, supplied, protected. It was law. Refusing to aid a courier bearing the paisa was more than impolite. It was treason. In this way, the Mongol Empire maintained a flow of information that was as secure as it was fast. But the system did more than move messages. It moved people. Diplomats crossed deserts and forests with confidence, knowing that at the end of each day, there would be shelter. Scholars could travel between far-flung cities, bringing with them not only texts, but perspectives. Merchants, once wary of the dangers beyond their homelands, now rode under the silent protection of the Yam. As the empire expanded into China, Persia, and Eastern Europe, the Yam expanded with it, adapting to each terrain with quiet intelligence. In mountainous regions, smaller horses were used. In harsh climates, routes were adjusted seasonally. There were even reports of frozen rivers being turned into temporary roads in winter, allowing couriers to glide swiftly across ice rather than fight snowbound trails. It was a system that respected nature without fearing it. The couriers themselves were chosen not for nobility or wealth, but for skill. Many were from steppe clans, born on horseback, able to read landscapes the way others read maps. They knew the stars, the wind, the subtle shifts in cloud or bird flight that foretold weather. They rode with urgency, but without recklessness. A lost courier was not only a missed message, it was a break in the empire's heartbeat. So each one was trained to endure solitude, to outlast storms, to navigate by instinct and keep moving forward. Stories passed quietly between stations, of riders chased by wolves or caught in river floods, or waking to snow so deep it buried their tent. And yet they continued, one horse, 1 mile, one message at a time. The Yam was more than physical, it was cultural. It encouraged communication in a way no previous empire had achieved. Messages were not lost in bureaucracy, nor delayed by suspicion. Trust was built into the system. The Khan's word, once written and sealed, could reach a commander thousands of kilometers away in a matter of days. An ambassador's report could leave Kiev and arrive in the halls of Karakorum without ever leaving the protection of Mongol infrastructure. And because the system worked, it was respected. Even conquered regions once hostile came to rely on it. Local rulers submitted to the Khan's authority not only out of fear, but out of recognition. This system made life easier, trade faster, knowledge wider. It brought order where before there was isolation. And in the center of it all, unseen by most, was the network of riders, stations, and routes that carried it all forward. They had no trumpets, no flags, no monuments, but their impact was immense. Through the Yam, the Mongol Empire became aware of itself, not just as land or power, but as an interconnected whole. It allowed policies to adapt, rebellions to be quelled, and resources to be managed across vast distances. It turned geography from a barrier into a bridge. And beneath it all, a quiet rhythm pulsed. Hoofbeats over dust, the whisper of wind through tents, the steady, tireless movement of those who rode not for glory, but for purpose. And now, as your breath slows and your mind drifts like a feather over the steppe, imagine those distant roads again. lit only by moonlight, silent but alive, carved not into stone, but into the memory of the land. And moving across them, a lone rider, focused, sure, and held by a promise older than any border. The promise that messages matter, that connection matters, that something soft and silent can hold the weight of an empire. Among the windswept plains and the snow-capped ridges, through forests thick with pine and deserts stretching endlessly under a pale sky, the yam rode silently on. It did not ask to be seen. It did not need to be remembered in marble or gold. It lived in movement, in message, in the steady gallop of a courier crossing from one world to another. And in this steady rhythm, the Mongol Empire maintained something far more powerful than conquest. It preserved connection. The scale of the system was astonishing. At its height, historians estimate there were over 10,000 relay stations, with 200,000 horses in circulation. Riders moved in a rotation, handing messages from one to another, sometimes without speaking, their only language the passing of reins and the whisper of leather satchels filled with sealed commands, royal decrees, diplomatic notes, trade manifests, and reports from the furthest corners of the realm. It was a system designed with absolute clarity. No message must stop. No word must be delayed. No part of the empire must ever be left unheard. In a time when crossing even one region could take weeks or months, the yam made it possible to travel the empire not with the body, but with words. These words became the lifeblood of governance. From the Ilkhanate in Persia to the Yuan dynasty in China, from the Golden Horde in the west to the central court of the Great Khan, the yam held them all together, not by force, but by understanding. If a city ran low on grain, word could be sent. If a border post spotted suspicious movements, the news reached commanders quickly. If a new law was issued, it could ripple outward like a calm wave across the steppes, reaching even the smallest garrison or the most remote village. But the true elegance of the system was in how it preserved both control and flexibility. Each station was run by a local steward, responsible for maintaining the horses, the food, and the sleeping quarters. But they were also trusted. Trusted to make decisions, to adapt when weather or war changed the routes, to care for travelers and ensure that the yam continued, no matter what passed beyond the edges of the road. The couriers, too, became legends in their own quiet way. Some were said to ride for 3 days without rest, eating only dried meat and melting snow. Others guided dignitaries across unfamiliar lands, speaking several languages, always calm, always precise. They were the invisible threads of diplomacy and empire, known not by name, but by reliability. And there were stories, softly told around fires, passed on by travelers, of letters carried across continents, wrapped in silk, their contents never spoken aloud, their delivery as sacred as prayer. Even enemies of the Mongols, captured and later released, spoke of the yam with reluctant admiration. European envoys wrote of it in wonder, describing how swiftly they were moved from one station to the next, how well they were fed, how every request was answered before it was finished. They had never seen anything like it, not in the courts of kings nor the empires of old. There was no bureaucracy to slow the process, no tangled layers of permission or delay. There was only movement, trusted, purposeful movement. It is difficult now in a world where messages travel in an instant to grasp the full impact of what the yam achieved. But imagine a time when most people never left their region, when news from another country might take years to arrive, if it arrived at all. And then imagine, in the heart of that world, a letter written by the Great Khan, sealed with a mark of command, traveling thousands of kilometers in just a few days, delivered by hand, unchanged, untouched. This was not just infrastructure, it was vision. It was the understanding that communication builds not only trade and order, but culture, unity, and peace. That an empire is not just measured in land, but in how it listens. And so the yam became a whispering thread across the vastness, a soft hum beneath the louder stories of conquest and expansion. Tonight, as you breathe and close your eyes, let yourself follow that whisper. Let your thoughts ride across the silent road. Feel the rhythm of the hooves against the earth, the cool air of dawn brushing your cheeks. There are no cities to conquer, no battles to win. Only the message you carry, the one that moves across time, across space, quietly holding everything together. The message that says, we are connected, and that is enough. As the Mongol Empire matured and the lines on the map stretched farther than any had imagined, the Yam continued to operate with quiet precision. It had no fanfare, no spectacle, no triumphant symbols carved into stone, and yet, it was one of the most sophisticated tools of empire the world had ever known. In a landscape as vast as the one ruled by the Mongols, spanning deserts, steppes, forests, rivers, and mountain passes, the Yam became not only a logistical network, but a lifeline. It breathed with the rhythm of hoofbeats and carried the heartbeat of the empire with every sealed document passed from one hand to another. But beyond the official reports and the royal decrees, the Yam served another purpose. One more subtle, but no less important. It carried knowledge. Not only the hard knowledge of borders and taxes and military movements, but soft knowledge, stories, rumors, discoveries, questions. When a caravan master in Bukhara heard of strange astronomical charts being drawn in the east, word could pass to scholars in Baghdad. When a merchant in Tabriz traded with a foreigner speaking a language no one recognized, the tale could make its way to the ears of linguists in the Khan's court. The Yam, in this way, became not just a postal system, but an intellectual web. And at the center of it sat not a library, but a living empire that valued curiosity. The great Khans, Genghis, Ogadai, Kublai, and those who followed understood something rare for their time. That strength was more than conquest. It was knowledge, flexibility, and communication. And so they protected the Yam fiercely. Routes were mapped and guarded. Stations were kept in working order even during times of war. Resources were diverted, not for decoration, but to ensure that the flow of information never stopped. And the result was an empire that, despite its size, could respond like a single body. Its limbs vast, but its mind focused. There are records of a message being carried from Beijing to Persia in just a few weeks, a staggering achievement for the era. And this was not achieved through magic or miracle, but through preparation, through unity, and through the relentless dedication of those who rode the paths in silence, day after day, night after night. The Yam stations themselves were simple, often nothing more than a few yurts, some corrals for horses, and a cooking fire. But they were positioned with care, always near fresh water, always near fodder for the animals, and often near settlements where repairs and provisions could be found if needed. Riders would arrive exhausted, dismount quickly, pass their satchels to the next courier, and within moments, the message would be moving again. Some paused only long enough to eat dried cheese or fermented mare's milk before riding once more into the open land, trusting the stars above and the trail beneath their horses' hooves. These couriers did not leave behind monuments, but they left behind a different kind of legacy, an invisible one, traced not in stone, but in memory. The kind of legacy that lives in systems that work so well, they disappear into the background. In a world where slowness was the norm, the Yam moved like wind. In an age where borders were barriers, it made them permeable. In a time when empires often collapsed under the weight of their own silence, the Mongols built one that could hear itself breathe. And it was not just rulers who benefited. Artists, healers, craftsmen, and pilgrims used the Yam routes. Ideas moved faster, techniques spread farther. A new method for glassmaking could reach cities hundreds of miles apart. A medicinal herb discovered in the East could be described to physicians in the West. A verse of poetry written in one tongue might be recited in another, far from its origin, and still be understood. That was the quiet miracle of the Yam, not just the speed of its messages, but the invisible bridges it built between people who might never meet, but now shared a line of connection. And while history has celebrated the grand campaigns and dramatic battles, it is here, in the soft thunder of hooves across moonlit trails, in the exchange of documents beneath a windswept tent, in the simple act of a rider continuing forward, that we find the true engine of the empire. It did not roar, it whispered, and that whisper carried across continents. Tonight, as your thoughts settle like dust on a quiet step, imagine once more that vastness, open skies, endless paths, the soft rhythm of travel. You are not lost. You are part of something that stretches far and wide, carried forward by care, by purpose, and by the unbroken chain of those who came before you, riding beneath the same stars, toward the same silence. As the Mongol Empire moved through time, expanding into new territories and weaving new cultures into its fold, the Yam remained steady, unmoving in principle, yet constantly adapting in practice. It was the quiet companion to every war, the silent witness to every treaty, the overlooked artery through which the empire's true strength flowed. While the world outside shifted with politics and power, inside the Yam there was only the message and the mission. The roads, sometimes little more than dirt trails carved by repeated hoofbeats, stretched over the backs of mountains, through river valleys, across desert plains, and frozen forests. They linked royal courts to distant provinces, scholars to libraries, governors to generals, and strangers to the unknown. No matter how far one traveled within the Mongol realm, they were never truly alone. Somewhere ahead or behind, another courier rode, another station waited, another fire flickered beneath a distant tent. The Yam transformed distance from an obstacle into a path. There were regions where language barriers were insurmountable, where cultures differed in ways both subtle and deep. But the Yam did not speak, it moved. And movement, when performed with care and reliability, speaks its own language. In its consistency, it created trust. In its silence, it carried respect. And in its persistence, it became part of the invisible promise the empire made to its people, that they would not be forgotten, no matter how far from the center they lived. This promise took form not only in the riders, but in the way the stations were cared for. Local communities often took pride in maintaining their stretch of the network. Villagers fed the horses, repaired worn harnesses, and sometimes shared stories with passing couriers who brought with them rumors of cities and cultures most would never see. These brief interactions, small exchanges at dawn or dusk, were moments of connection, bridges between the known and the vast unknown. And in these moments, the Yam became something more than a postal system. It became a thread of shared humanity. There are reports from foreign travelers who, having heard of the Yam before ever stepping foot in Mongol lands, were nevertheless unprepared for the hospitality they encountered. A French monk, astonished by the precision of the system, described being welcomed at station after station with warmth, food, and rest, despite being an outsider in unfamiliar territory. Others noted how the stations, though simple, were clean, organized, and stocked. Everything a traveler needed was provided, without fanfare, without suspicion. It was a culture of quiet welcome, efficient yet kind. The Mongol leaders understood that the Yam was more than infrastructure. It was a reflection of their governance. An empire that could move its thoughts across great distances without delay was an empire that could think clearly, react swiftly, and hold itself together even under pressure. And so, even when wars flared or borders shifted, the Yam continued. Messages still moved. Roads were repaired. Horses were replaced. Riders were trained. It was a system that, like the pulse of a living creature, never ceased. And in its endurance, the Yam did more than serve power. It preserved order. It preserved memory. It preserved the delicate bonds that made the vastness of the Mongol world feel like a single whole. Through it came not only communication, but learning. Medical knowledge from China found its way west. Mathematical concepts from Persia flowed east. Art, music, instruments, and even cooking methods traveled faster than ever before. It was not just a Mongol empire, it was a connected world. And though the riders did not know it, with each journey they were carrying more than words. They were carrying transformation. They were weaving the beginnings of globalization. The quiet echoes of their hoofbeats shaped a future they would never see. And now, as your own breath begins to slow, as the room around you grows still, imagine that gentle motion. The soft sway of a horse under moonlight, the rustle of papers inside a leather pouch, the smell of dust and pine, tea and fire. And far ahead, on the open plain, the flicker of a distant station's lamp, waiting. The road is long, but it is not lonely, because with every step forward, the message moves too. And in that movement, something eternal continues, calm, steady, whole. As the Yam expanded with the empire, it began to absorb the character of the lands it touched. Though its structure remained Mongol in its foundations, simple, disciplined, and efficient, it adapted to different terrains, climates, and customs with a quiet intelligence. In the snow-swept forests of the north, stations were insulated with thick layers of bark and fur. In the vast deserts of Central Asia, they were built low and narrow, offering shade during the searing days and warmth during the chill of night. In more urban centers, they might even resemble modest inns, where travelers could wash their faces, mend their garments, and sleep on woven mats under thin linen. But no matter how they looked, their purpose never changed: to support movement and to keep the threads of the empire unbroken. Each station, though seemingly small, was part of a much larger rhythm. One could imagine it as the heartbeat of the Mongol world, soft but steady. These outposts became places of rest, not just for horses and couriers, but also for diplomats, merchants, and monks. Their presence offered more than utility; they offered reassurance. To see the flicker of a yam station's fire in the distance was to know that someone had passed this way before, that others would follow, that one was not alone. The horses, chosen with care, were the unsung heroes of the yam. Light, fast, and hardy, Mongol ponies could survive on sparse grazing and endure long distances in harsh conditions. Every few miles, fresh horses were waiting, their breath visible in the morning frost or their flanks glistening under the desert sun. A courier might ride dozens of miles before switching to a new horse, allowing messages to continue without pause. And these messages, sealed in leather tubes or bound tightly in oiled cloth, carried more than orders from the Khan. They carried maps, medical texts, reports of strange diseases, descriptions of plants, sketches of architecture, philosophical questions, observations of stars, and in time the yam carried another cargo too: memory. As empires rose and fell, as borders moved like shadows on parchment, the yam endured, and through it, stories survived. A scribe in Samarkand might copy a tale from a traveler who had passed through a week before. A child in Karakoram might grow up hearing about a foreign merchant who once stopped by, sharing songs in a language no one understood. These moments, scattered and small, became a kind of folklore, not of myth, but of movement. The yam did not just connect cities, it connected lives. Even the couriers themselves became part of this quiet mythology. Anonymous in the records, their names forgotten, their faces unremembered, but their deeds lived on in the consistency of the system. They rode through rainstorms and sandstorms, through hunger and cold, through war and silence. They crossed rivers swollen from spring melt, and plains cracked dry in summer. They lit their fires in caves and on open hillsides. They kept moving, not for glory, but for duty, and perhaps for something else as well, a sense of belonging. To ride for the yam was to be trusted, to be relied upon, to be part of something larger. And that something, the network, the empire, the great hum of movement, was as much about people as it was about power. In time, the very efficiency of the yam impressed even its critics. European envoys marveled at the speed with which letters arrived. Persian scholars studied the methods of the relay. Arab historians recorded tales of the riders who changed mounts without ever dismounting fully, moving like shadows across the land. Some even wondered if such a system might be replicated elsewhere. But it was not just a matter of horses and stations. It was a matter of culture, of discipline, of shared understanding. The yam worked not because it was enforced, but because it was believed in. And that belief, that messages mattered, that connection mattered, was perhaps its greatest strength. Tonight, as your eyelids grow heavier, think of a quiet trail stretching far into the darkness. The stars above shimmer gently. Somewhere, a rider makes their way through the silence, the sound of hooves soft against the earth. And at the end of that path, a small fire waits, tended by hands that expect him. The message is safe, the road is clear, and the empire, vast and still, continues to breathe in rhythm. In the later years of the Mongol Empire, as its borders began to stretch thinner and its political center shifted, the yam remained one of the few constants. Even as khanates fractured and successor states vied for dominance, the pulse of the postal roads continued, quietly threading the remnants of empire together. These were no longer the golden days of unified conquest, but the yam did not require glory to function. It needed only its riders, its stations, its belief in movement. In some regions, former Mongol territories kept the system alive on their own. Local rulers, recognizing its value, preserved what they could, patching roads, housing travelers, keeping horses ready. Even if the empire itself dimmed like an aging star, the roads still remembered. In this way, the yam outlived the rule of the Khans. It became something older than memory, deeper than law. Traders continued to move silks and spices. Diplomats still sent letters and gifts. And travelers, those rare souls who wandered not for power but for knowledge, found in the yam a companion of quiet reliability. They would arrive at stations and find food warm, beds laid, a host ready with tea and news. Sometimes nothing had changed in years. The same elderly station keeper might still be tending to the same hearth, still remembering the name of a rider who passed through long ago. The world around might have turned more dangerous, less stable, but within the station walls there was calm, a hush that stretched across time. Scholars in Baghdad wrote of receiving books from China that arrived in weeks rather than months. Missionaries from Rome sent word to their brothers thousands of miles away, and with patience received replies. A merchant in Kashgar could learn of a caravan ambushed near the Caspian. A physician in Samarkand might receive a list of symptoms describing an illness emerging near the Black Sea. The yam didn't just carry words, it carried awareness. And awareness, in an empire as wide and diverse as this one, was power. That power, though silent, held back chaos for longer than anyone expected. It softened the cracks in a breaking empire. In some places, the yam became the last visible sign that there had once been something greater, an order that, for a time, had spanned from Korea to Kiev. It was not grand monuments or palaces that kept people remembering. It was the roads, the riders, and the rhythm. And those who served it, often poor, often anonymous, understood the quiet weight of their duty. For them, riding was not just about getting from one place to another. It was about preserving a thread, keeping the world stitched together even as it threatened to unravel. There are stories, half lost in dusty scrolls and faded oral traditions, of riders who crossed war zones, who delivered messages that saved cities, who refused bribes to betray letters meant for kings. Their faces were never carved in stone, but their actions echoed like hoofbeats in the fog. Even as empires rose to replace the Mongols, the idea of the yam lingered. In Russia, in China, in Persia, systems appeared that echoed its model. The efficiency of the relay, the dignity of the message, the duty of the rider. These seeds had been planted, and they took root in new soil. In some ways, every modern postal system still carries the DNA of the yam. The idea that communication deserves speed, that distance must not defeat understanding, that somewhere, someone waits to receive your words. And now, as you lie still and safe, breathing slowly, let that idea travel with you. Picture a dusty road under starlight, the moon casting long shadows behind a galloping horse. Picture a low station house with a thin plume of smoke rising from the roof. A kettle warms, a bed is made, and on the table, a scroll sealed in wax waits for its next journey. The world outside may change, but within the story of the yam, there is something eternal, something that moves quietly forward, carrying light through distance and time. Beyond its practical purpose, the yam quietly shaped how people thought about movement itself. In a world where most individuals rarely traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, the idea that messages, and by extension thoughts, could travel thousands of miles was nothing short of extraordinary. It was not just a postal service. It was a thread connecting lives, a silent witness to the evolution of empires and ideas. Along these routes, languages blended and accents softened. Traders from India learned words in Mongolian. Scribes in Bukhara began using phrases from China. A priest might offer blessings in Arabic to a caravan of Buddhist monks, and in the hum of those exchanges, something subtle but profound was happening. The yam was not only carrying scrolls, it was carrying culture, and culture, once in motion, does not return unchanged. Travelers would arrive in cities like Tabriz or Sarai, having ridden for weeks, and they brought with them more than goods. They brought news of far-off markets, of strange music heard in a village no map recorded, of food cooked in unfamiliar spices, of tensions brewing, of legends forming. Every message carried inside a satchel was followed by countless unspoken messages carried in the eyes and voices of those who traveled, and the yam made room for all of it. The couriers, though trained in silence and discipline, could not help but absorb the flavor of the world they crossed. Their minds, like the hooves of their horses, touched countless lands, and those impressions lingered. It is said that in some remote stations, The only record of a distant war was a single drawing made in the margins of a guest book, or that the first time a shepherd in the Altai Mountains heard of the Mediterranean Sea, it was from a yam courier who had seen the pale blue shimmer from the cliffs of Antioch. Stories, shared in whispers by firesides, would find their way into local lore. A song learned by one writer might be hummed years later in a distant outpost, its meaning lost, but its melody intact. This was the poetry of the yam, soft, slow, accidental, but enduring. In time, even the horses came to carry meaning. Certain colors, certain markings, certain strengths were preferred for particular routes. A pale gray horse with dark ankles might be prized on snowbound trails. A lean brown one with a scar across its flank might be known to outlast any on desert rides. And each horse, like its rider, became part of a rhythm so steady it barely needed words. The bond between human and animal on the yam was quiet but deep. A courier might whisper encouragement to his mount in the middle of the night. He might sing to it when the winds rose. And when a horse grew too old to ride, it was often allowed to live its final days near the station where it had served, grazing in peace, watched over by the same hands that had once saddled it in haste. These details rarely make it into the grand histories of conquest and kings, but they lived in the margins, in the shared memory of those who knew what it meant to carry something across vast silence. And for the people who lived along the yam, the sight of a rider in the distance was more than routine. It was a moment of pause, a glimpse into the wider world. Children would run to watch the horses pass. Elders would nod solemnly, remembering times when news changed everything. Merchants would listen eagerly, hoping for updates on prices, routes, or dangers. The yam was not just motion, it was expectation, a gentle heartbeat in places where change moves slowly. And now, as you close your eyes and breathe a little deeper, imagine that heartbeat continuing. Somewhere in a forgotten landscape, a lone rider adjusts his cloak and guides his horse forward. A river glimmers ahead. A station waits on the other side. Inside, a fire is crackling softly. A bowl of warm broth sits on a table, and someone, perhaps an old friend, perhaps a stranger, will be there to receive the next message. Not for glory, not for power, but because the road continues, and someone must keep it alive. As the centuries passed and the golden age of the Mongol Empire gave way to the shifting tides of regional kingdoms and successor states, the physical structure of the yam began to wear with time. Stations once carefully tended were left unattended for seasons at a time. The roads, pressed flat by generations of hooves, began to crack where no fresh hands repaired them. Yet even as maps changed and banners fell, pieces of the yam endured in quiet corners of the continent. In the hills of northern Persia, farmers still recognized the remains of an old relay station, its square footprint just visible beneath the wild grasses, the stones oddly aligned, the air faintly shaped by memory. In the forests of eastern Russia, travelers told stories of a narrow wooden house where, it was said, horses once waited for riders who never returned. These fragments were more than ruins. They were echoes of a system that once dared to connect oceans, cultures, and ideas without needing a throne at its center. In many ways, the yam's greatest accomplishment was not military or political. It was emotional. It made people feel less alone. A village that might have once waited years for distant news began to expect regular updates. A monk in a desert monastery knew he could receive letters from a cousin across the steppe. The yam brought comfort through predictability, reassurance through rhythm. And it wasn't just those who sent or received messages who benefited. The system gave purpose to those who lived on the margins. Riders, grooms, cooks, builders, people who might otherwise be forgotten, became part of something larger, something quietly essential. The yam gave them a role in a grand, unspoken story. Even when the riders were not seen for weeks, their presence was felt. The wind through the reeds might stir memories of distant hooves. A knock at the door after sunset might still spark hope. For those who had once known the rhythm of the yam, it was not so easily forgotten. There were times, during plagues, invasions, famines, when the roads fell silent. But silence did not mean erasure. After the storm passed, someone would rebuild a broken post, water the grass near the horse trough, reattach the bronze plaque that marked a station's name. These small acts of care spoke of something deeper than duty. They spoke of trust in the journey, in the need to keep something moving even when all else stood still. In the years that followed, many empires tried to replicate the yam. They built roads, trained riders, marked distances. But something ineffable was often missing. The original yam was born not just of planning, but of belief. Belief in connection across vastness. Belief that messages mattered. Belief that the path itself had meaning. Perhaps this is why travelers centuries later still wrote about it with awe. A Persian poet once described the yam as a river made of horses, flowing without water, carrying words instead of fish. A Chinese official called it a bridge that rides on wind. Their metaphors were not just poetic flourishes. They were attempts to grasp something too expansive, too ephemeral for simple terms. And now, as you lie still in your own quiet place, thousands of miles and years removed from that world, you are still part of it. You are listening to a story shaped by roads long faded, names long forgotten, but meaning that endures. Let your breath follow the rhythm of that ancient journey. Inhale, like a rider filling his lungs before dawn. Exhale, like the wind passing through open valleys. Somewhere out there, under a sky full of stars, the yam continues. Maybe not in form, but in spirit. In the hush of communication, in the gentle certainty that, even across distance, something or someone is always moving closer. As we reach the quiet end of this long and dust-covered road, the story of the yam lingers not as a monument of power, but as a whisper carried by the wind across forgotten landscapes. There is no grand ruin left to visit, no towering stone carved with the names of couriers or the horses that bore them. And yet, perhaps, that is what makes its memory so haunting. It lives not in spectacle but in trace, a broken post beneath the earth, a dip in the land where wheels once rolled, a local word borrowed from far away and still used without thought. It is difficult to grasp the full scale of the yam from our modern vantage point, where the push of a button sends messages faster than arrows ever flew. But maybe that's precisely why it matters. The Mongol relay system asked something of its participants: patience, trust, and perseverance. Messages were not instant. They were earned, carried with care, handed from one stranger to the next in a chain of invisible faith. The sender trusted that someone would ride for days to deliver a simple scroll. The receiver trusted that the message, when it arrived, had endured wind and rain and time. There was weight in that slowness, meaning in the movement. In a world where lives were often small, bounded by village and season, the yam expanded the horizon. It taught people to think in distance, to imagine events far beyond what they could see. A child growing up near a station might daydream of distant lands, fueled by the sight of passing riders with dusty cloaks and unreadable maps. A farmer might hear of a new ruler, not through an army, but from a rider offering water for his horse and a few words of news. These were not declarations shouted by heralds. They were murmurs passed gently, shaped by the landscape itself. And the landscape, too, was shaped in return. Paths were beaten into permanence. Forests gave way to trails. Rivers became familiar crossings. Even the stars were studied more carefully by those who rode at night, not for wonder, but for direction. In that way, the yam was both physical and spiritual. It was a system, yes, but also a symbol of connection, of endurance, of the quiet dignity found in doing one's duty well, even when no one is watching. Some riders never returned. Their names were not recorded. Their stories were never told. But the letters they carried reached their destinations. The news arrived. The silence was broken, where someone smiled, cried, prepared, prayed, because a message had come. And that is the legacy, not in conquest, but in continuity, not in triumph, but in trust. As the empire that birthed it faded into history, the yam left behind no loud farewell. It simply kept going until one day, it didn't. And even then, the habits it instilled, of movement, of communication, of perseverance, carried on in other forms. Roads became trade routes, posts became villages, routines became rituals. And now, centuries later, as you lie here with your eyes closed and your breath steady, you are part of that legacy too. You have followed the rhythm of the yam across the steppe, through the mountains, past the fires of countless forgotten stations. You have listened to the hooves that no longer sound, felt the wind that once brushed the faces of riders long gone. you have remembered something most have forgotten. And in that quiet remembering, you've honored them. Let this final thought carry you gently into sleep. Somewhere in the dark, a rider still moves. A message still waits. A light still flickers in the night. Not for glory, not for gain, but because the road once mattered and still does. That brings us to the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next quiet journey, if you're still with us, I'd truly appreciate a gentle tap on the like button and maybe a soft click to subscribe. Every small action helps keep this sleepy corner of YouTube alive. And now, let's drift together into the next chapter of our slow, uneventful voyage through time as we enter the floating worlds of Edo, Japan. In the hushed twilight of the Edo period, Japan drifted into a peculiar stillness, wrapped in more than 2 centuries of self-imposed isolation, a policy known as sakoku, where foreigners were kept at bay and Japanese people were forbidden to leave. Behind this closed door, a world bloomed slowly and quietly, away from the clang of European conquest or the chaos of global trade. It was in this muted space that something unexpected unfolded. Not a revolution, not a war, but a dreamlike society layered in rules and rituals, art and etiquette, silence and color. This was Edo, Japan, a place that did not explode outward, but rather folded inward, like the meticulous layers of a kimono. Life in the capital, now known as Tokyo, followed a rhythm so precise it could be measured in footsteps. The wooden sandals of merchants clacked softly against stone. Rickshaw wheels groaned across narrow lanes. Paper lanterns swayed ever so slightly in the breeze that wandered through long, covered walkways. It was a world of symmetry and modesty, where every object, gesture, and sound had a place, and nothing was wasted. At the heart of this world were the chonin, the townspeople, who, though officially considered the lowest in the strict class hierarchy, beneath samurai, farmers, and artisans, became the unlikely creators of a cultural golden age. It is here, nestled between the mundane rituals of rice counting and curfews, that the term ukiyo took root. Literally translated as floating world, ukiyo originally described the Buddhist concept of the sorrowful, ever-changing nature of human existence. But in Edo, the term was turned on its head. The people reimagined it as a world not of sorrow, but of fleeting beauty and transient pleasures. The floating world became a space apart, a dreamscape within the confines of everyday duty. It referred not to geography, but to a mood, a hidden realm that could be accessed through art, poetry, theater, and even everyday moments when time seemed to pause. Tea being poured with precision, the sound of a shamisen vibrating through a paper wall, the rustle of silk as a courtesan adjusted her obi in the mirror. These were the doors to the floating world. And so the chonin built their own quiet empire, not of stone or steel, but of woodblock prints and moonlit strolls, of laughter in the kabuki theater and whispered poems passed in fan-folded letters. They frequented the pleasure quarters of Yoshiwara, not only for company or entertainment, but to escape the rigid structures of their daily lives. In the floating world, you could become someone else, if only for a moment. A sake merchant could feel like a poet. A lowly clerk could fall in love with a geisha. And though it was understood that these moments were impermanent, that they would dissolve like mist come morning, they were treasured all the more for their fragility. In the great marketplace of Edo, prints known as ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, became tokens of this transient beauty. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige captured landscapes, courtesans, sumo wrestlers, and city scenes with a delicate eye for mood and balance. These images, often simple and flat in form, carried an emotional weight far deeper than their outlines suggested. They were not only art, but memory made visible. The floating world was not merely a place, but a way of seeing, of being. It invited people to accept the impermanence of life, not in despair, but in appreciation, to linger a little longer over a plum blossom, to notice the way snow gathered on a gate, to find a kind of peace in the smallness of one's role. It was an antidote to ambition, a soft rebellion against the noise of history. And in this quiet rebellion, something eternal was born, not through monuments or wars, but through the gentle insistence that beauty matters, even if it fades, especially if it fades. As the floating world began to take deeper root in the cultural soil of Edo, it evolved not merely as a pastime or a physical location, but as a rhythm that pulsed quietly beneath the surface of daily life. It wove its way into the spaces between obligation and leisure, forming a delicate counterbalance to the rigid hierarchies and responsibilities that defined the Tokugawa period. Though life was tightly ordered and deeply stratified, with the shogun at the top, samurai beneath him, then farmers, artisans, and merchants last, there was a strange irony in the fact that those considered lowest, the merchants and townspeople, became the quiet curators of beauty. Their wealth, while officially looked down upon, allowed them to sponsor art performances and publishing in a way that the sword-bearing samurai could not. The samurai class, though honored, lived under frugal expectations, their days spent in bureaucratic duties and moral restraint. But in the alleys of entertainment districts and inside sliding paper walls, the chonin shaped a softer kind of legacy. There, candlelight flickered against painted screens, the air held the faint scent of sandalwood, and stories unfolded in the slow gestures of a kabuki actor or the subtle tilt of a geisha's head. The pleasure quarters such as Yoshiwara in Edo, Shinmachi in Osaka, and Shimabara in Kyoto were not simply red light districts as later perceptions might suggest, but rather curated microcosms of refined escape. Within them, the passage of time changed texture. It didn't speed or slow, but settled into something else entirely, a time of lingering, of waiting, of noticing. Patrons would gather not for spectacle alone, but for subtle performance, poetic exchange, music that seemed to float rather than play. A conversation might last an hour and cover nothing of importance, and that was its beauty. One could lose themselves in the flick of a fan or the clink of porcelain. Geisha and courtesans were not merely objects of affection, but artisans in their own right, trained in music, poetry, dance, and the fine art of conversation. Their role was not only to entertain, but to elevate the mood into something almost ethereal, to weave ordinary evenings into moments that shimmered faintly, like distant lanterns on water. In parallel, the world of ukiyo-e continued to bloom. Woodblock printing had existed for centuries, but in Edo it reached new levels of sophistication and popularity. The process itself was painstaking, requiring an artist to draw, a carver to prepare the blocks, a printer to apply inks, and publishers to coordinate it all. But what emerged from this collective effort were images that captured more than just appearance. They offered a glimpse into how people wanted to see their world. Not necessarily how it was, but how it felt when viewed through the lens of longing and memory. Prints of famous courtesans or actors became not only decorative items, but emotional keepsakes, akin to collecting moments of stillness. Even landscapes, particularly those by Hiroshige, carried the same tranquil weight. A quiet bridge in the rain, a village beneath falling snow, cherry blossoms above a winding path. Each scene was composed not for drama, but for peace. Even as the floating world embraced entertainment, it never rushed. Even as it celebrated beauty, it did not demand it last. This calm awareness of impermanence, of things beautiful because they fade, was not only tolerated but cherished. And so people kept returning, to the theaters where the curtain fell like a sigh, to tea houses where laughter mixed with the tapping of Geta sandals, to riverbanks where paper lanterns drifted downstream, each one carrying a hope or memory or whisper into the night. It was in these small, drifting things that Edo Japan found a kind of immortality, not carved in stone, but suspended gently in air, in ink, in passing song. And this is perhaps what made the floating world so enduring. It never tried to conquer time. It simply danced with it, softly, and then let it go. As twilight deepened over the wooden rooftops of Edo, the floating world settled into its most tranquil form. The streets that had once echoed with the bustle of midday merchants and the clatter of palanquins now softened beneath the hush of evening. Lanterns blinked to life one by one, their paper skins glowing with amber warmth, swaying slightly in the night breeze like sleepy fireflies. The scent of grilled fish and simmered soy drifted from kitchens tucked behind narrow alleys, while the rhythmic tapping of shamisen strings began to rise from behind shoji doors. Here, time no longer marched forward. It floated. Just as the name ukiyo suggests, the floating world was never meant to be tethered to the ground. And yet, beneath its gentle surface, there lay a complex network of craftsmen, performers, poets, and publishers, each contributing in quiet collaboration to an illusion of effortlessness. Ukiyo was not built in a single brushstroke, but in layers of devotion. Take, for example, the Kabuki theater, whose origins stretched back to the early 17th century, when a bold woman named Okuni first danced along the dry riverbeds of Kyoto. Over time, the art form evolved, outlawed for women and passed on to male actors who specialized in portraying female roles, onagata, bringing to life the grace, tragedy, and resilience of countless heroines. The performances were dramatic but stylized, every movement deliberate, every fan flick or head tilt carrying volumes of meaning. Audiences did not merely watch. They surrendered to the rhythm, the pacing, the steady climb and fall of emotion that washed over them like waves. In the floating world, silence was as expressive as speech. Stillness was not absence, but presence. Meanwhile, tea houses offered a different tempo. Removed from the grandeur of theater, they emphasized subtlety. A guest might spend hours in a single room, savoring a bowl of tea that had been whisked by hand, served in a ceramic cup chosen not for perfection, but for the uniqueness of its glaze. Conversation drifted, often landing nowhere in particular. It was not uncommon to sit beside someone for an entire evening and exchange no more than a few words. The point was not in talking, but in sharing space. Acknowledging the quiet companionship of another soul adrift in the same evening, artists and poets gathered in these spaces too, sketching fleeting impressions or composing short verses in the haiku form. A frog leaps into the pond, splash, that is all. But in that moment, the entire world is suspended in still water and sound. This minimalist art mirrored the broader philosophy that defined Edo's floating world. Impermanence was not to be mourned, it was to be celebrated. Cherry blossoms, which bloomed in a spectacular blur of white and pink each spring, lasted only days before carpeting the ground in delicate confetti. People gathered beneath them not to hold on, but to witness their passing. The fleeting nature of beauty was its most treasured quality. In the print shops of Nihonbashi, woodblock artists continued to capture such moments. Not only landscapes and portraits, but scenes of daily life. A child chasing a paper kite, a vendor ladling steaming soup into a bowl, a cat curled up on a sun-warmed mat. These were not grand histories. They were soft histories, lived quietly and remembered without noise. Even in the publishing houses, care was taken not just with content, but with mood. Paper was chosen for its texture, ink for its depth of tone. A well-made print did not shout, it sighed. And it was not only what it showed, but what it suggested. A curtain drawn halfway, a path that bends just out of sight, a figure walking away, not toward. These visual silences were the visual echoes of a culture that had learned to find depth in restraint. And so, the floating world did not rise in rebellion, did not demand permanence. It simply existed beside the real world, a gentle mirror that offered not escape, but pause. A breath between duties, a chance to remember that even in a tightly controlled society, beauty could still drift freely, like mist rising from the Sumida River. This was not revolution, it was reverie. And in the still hours of the night, long after the actors had bowed, after the ink had dried, and the lanterns had been dimmed, what remained was not noise but quiet. A quiet so soft it could only be heard by the soul that was ready to listen. As the floating world unfolded behind sliding paper screens and beneath rooftops tiled in gray, there existed an unspoken agreement among its many participants. A silent contract built on rituals, repetition, and reverence. Every movement had its place. Every tool had its resting position. Every silence had a shape. This was not a world designed for urgency, but for rhythm. From the moment a geisha tied her obi belt to the final brushstroke of an artist etching waves onto woodblock, the floating world operated on a time separate from the clock. It pulsed with a kind of elegant slowness, each action carried out with the care one might reserve for sacred ceremony. The tea house attendant, rising before dawn, would polish the floors in wide circular motions using a damp cloth, never hurrying, never skipping corners. His steps were silent, barefoot on tatami, and he worked not for praise, but because the task itself demanded grace. A clean floor was not just cleanliness, it was respect. Meanwhile, in the neighboring room, an apprentice geisha, still too young to perform on her own, sat practicing the subtle art of conversation. She did not rehearse clever lines or jokes, but rather learned how to read a room, how to offer presence without dominating space, how to nod with just enough weight to show that she was truly listening. These women were not entertainers in the Western sense. They were mirrors. They reflected back to each guest a quieter version of themselves, one softened by candlelight and warmed by a shared bowl of sake. In such encounters, words became secondary. A glance, a pause, the refilling of a cup, these spoke volumes. And within the world of ukiyo, even pleasure was not always loud. In the brothels of Yoshiwara, behind gates that closed at dusk and opened only at dawn, a different form of performance took place. Courtesans, especially the highest-ranked oiran, were not chosen merely for beauty. They were walking works of art, trained in poetry, music, calligraphy, and the complex politics of flattery. Their hairstyles alone took hours to construct, ornamented with pins and combs that clicked faintly with every tilt of the head. To be with an oiran was not simply to be served. It was to enter a theater where the play was slow and the roles well understood. A guest might wait months for a meeting, pay exorbitant sums for a single evening, and yet leave with only the memory of a poem recited in a whisper. This was not disappointment, it was design. Longing was part of the pleasure. Anticipation was an art. In parallel, the streets outside Yoshiwara maintained their own choreography. Candle merchants walked in silence, their wares protected under wooden covers. Itinerant fish sellers called out softly in sing-song tones, careful not to disturb those sleeping behind rice paper walls. Cats wandered rooftops. Wind rattled bamboo blinds. Nothing moved fast. And so it was that even the night had texture. Ukiyo was not bound by daylight. In fact, it came most alive when the sun had dipped behind Mount Fuji, and the moon rose to cast silver light across tiled eaves and rain-soaked alleys. Shadow and lamp became equal partners in the night's quiet theater, and for the printers and poets and painters still awake, this was when inspiration drifted in through the open window, uninvited but welcome. The master carver, for instance, would lean close to his wooden plate, blade in hand, carving the fine line of a woman's eyebrow or the delicate petal of a lotus. He did not rush. He breathed in time with his work. One mistake would ruin the entire print. But in this patience, there was peace. The same was true for the papermaker in the countryside, who dipped screens into vats of pulp and lifted them out again, allowing droplets to fall like quiet rain before laying each sheet flat to dry in the morning sun. No part of ukiyo was loud, no part of it asked for permanence, and yet it endured, because it never pretended to be anything other than what it was, a soft dream beside the waking world, a lull between obligations, a story whispered in candlelight that, even if forgotten by morning, left behind a feeling too subtle to name, but too warm to lose. In this way, the floating world did not disappear. It simply changed forms, like mist on the river, like steam rising from tea, like the final notes of a song played only once, but heard forever in the quiet after. In the quieter corners of Edo's floating world, where the lantern glow reached just far enough to suggest outlines but never details, artisans practiced their crafts not for glory, but for harmony. The kimono dyer, for instance, worked in shadows and water, using vats of indigo that had been fermenting for weeks in deep, earthy barrels. His hands moved like waves, folding and unfolding cloth, dipping and lifting with emotion refined over years. He didn't measure time by hours, but by how the color settled into the fabric, whether it breathed like twilight or still held the stubborn brightness of day. Around him, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional drip from dyed silk to wooden plank. And nearby, a woodblock printer might be preparing for a collaboration so delicate that it required multiple masters to complete. First came the designer, who drew the initial composition with a brush so soft it barely kissed the paper. Then came the carver, who transferred the lines to a cherrywood block, each cut precise enough to hold the soul of the design without bleeding into chaos. Finally, the printer arrived, pressing damp paper against the inked block with a baron. A handheld pad woven from twisted strands of bamboo. The process demanded a kind of sacred repetition. Press, lift, dry, press, lift, dry. A single ukiyo-e print might pass through dozens of hands before it reached the viewer, but no one claimed ownership. The work belonged to the moment, to the rhythm, to the unseen alignment of tools and patience. And as this artistry unfolded in the floating world, its audience remained both intimate and anonymous. A fisherman, returning from the Sumida River, might pause to admire a newly pasted print on a wall. A courtesan, resting between appointments, might run her fingers along the silk threads of a new obi. Children, barefoot in the alleys, might trace the lines of a wave drawn by Hokusai himself, unaware of the name, but knowing the feeling. This was the invisible current beneath Edo's visible life, a reverence for things made well, but made quietly. It extended even to the food. The chef who prepared grilled eel in a roadside stall did not shout to attract customers. He simply let the scent of tear sauce, sweet and smoky, drift on the breeze. The rice was not rushed. The charcoal was tended like a fire in a shrine. And for those who stopped to eat, the silence was part of the flavor. Even the writing of haiku, so small in form, carried the weight of the floating world. 17 syllables, a season, a moment, nothing more, nothing less. Basho once wrote of a frog leaping into an old pond, not for drama, but for stillness. The splash was not the point. The pause before and after was. In the pleasure quarters where music floated like incense and laughter drifted just out of reach, the nights were not always joyous, but they were always slow. A musician might pluck the shamisen with such precision that each note seemed suspended in air. A guest, too weary to speak, might watch the shadows dance on the paper screen and feel more seen than in a crowded banquet. In these quiet offerings, the floating world whispered its truths, not about escape, but about presence, about how beauty, when left undisturbed, finds its own breath. And as dawn crept once more across the sky, gently lighting the tiled rooftops and winding alleys, the world of Ukiyo began to fold itself away. The lanterns were extinguished, the shutters drawn, the actors removed their paint. The poet set down his brush, but nothing was lost, because the floating world, though built of fleeting things, was not meant to endure like stone. It was meant to echo, to linger in the spaces we carry, between tasks, between thoughts, between dreams. And so it remained, not in museums or history books, but in the quiet we allow ourselves when the noise has gone, in the stillness of a morning cup of tea, in the soft rustle of fabric before sleep, in the hush of snowfall across a garden, no longer tended, but never forgotten. As the seasons shifted gently across Edo, the floating world did not resist change. It embraced it in subtle ways, as a tree accepts falling leaves or a river yields to new bends. In spring, the cherry blossoms became the silent clock by which the city moved, their appearance marking not only the renewal of nature, but the quiet rhythm of daily life. No trumpet was sounded for their arrival, but people knew. They stepped more softly, spoke in tones softened by pink petals overhead, and allowed themselves to pause. Beneath the blooming trees, courtesans in soft silk walked slowly, their geta clicking faintly on stone, their sleeves brushing gently with the breeze. Artists brought their tools into the open, sketching not just the trees but the stillness they caused, the way light filtered through and touched the ground like memory. Poets would write not of grand events, but of how one petal landed in a sake cup, and how long it took to sink. These were not distractions, they were the essence. In summer, the lantern festivals floated across the canals like dreams that refused to vanish. Families gathered by the riverbanks not to cheer, but to watch light move with the water. Children held paper lanterns shaped like fish or moons, and their reflections in the ripples seemed more alive than the forms that carried them. On these warm nights, the air smelled of grilled squid and incense, and time itself seemed to sway. Music came from unseen corners, slow flutes, soft drums, a lone singer behind a curtain. No one clapped. They simply listened and let go. Even in the heart of the pleasure quarters, where indulgence was sold as easily as silks, there was a kind of unspoken discipline. The geisha learned not only music, calligraphy, and the delicate language of fans, but how to be silent at the right moment, how to pour tea without a sound, how to let a guest speak and say nothing, yet somehow still be heard. This was not submission, it was art. Autumn brought a different kind of fading, a graceful retreat into golden rust. The maple leaves turned quietly in the hills surrounding Edo, and their colors were not shouted in markets, but reflected in kimono patterns, in poetry, in the glazes of new ceramics brought to shopfronts along the Nakamis. Merchants did not need to advertise the season. The world wore it. Painters captured this angle of the afternoon light as it hit the eaves, and the long shadows of travelers returning from shrines. At this time, the floating world became more internal, more reflective. Guests stayed longer over warm sake. Stories were told in softer voices. The night air began to bite, and blankets were shared without mention. And then came winter. The snow was not feared, only accepted. It blanketed the city in a hush deeper than sleep. Footsteps vanished moments after they were made, and even the sounds of carts and wheels were muffled. Tea houses remained open, glowing like lanterns themselves, offering warmth not through fire alone, but through presence. A geisha's laugh, rare in these months, felt like a bell in the fog. The gardens, now bare, were more beautiful in their emptiness. Stones stood alone, branches curved with quiet dignity. Nothing was blooming, yet nothing lacked. And so the cycle turned. Each season not a challenge to survive, but a story to be heard. In the floating world of Edo, history did not move through declarations or battles. It moved through gestures. The way a hand smoothed a scroll, the way a curtain was drawn, the way one person waited a breath longer before replying. And in those spaces, meaning was born. No ruler decreed the mood of the city. No clock dictated its pace. Instead, it was the accumulation of countless small silences, of slow exchanges, of eyes that saw and hands that remembered. The floating world taught that even in transience, there is truth, that beauty lives not in what we hold forever, but in what we notice before it disappears. And as snow continued to fall in the lantern-lit alleys of Edo, no one rushed to capture it. They simply watched and let it fall. As winter deepened over Edo, and the snow settled like silk across tiled roofs and narrow lanes, the world inside began to grow more vivid. Not louder, but more intricate, more inward. Behind shoji screens and paper doors, life unfolded with deliberate care. The rituals of everyday survival, boiling water, folding bedding, brushing snow from wooden sandals, took on a kind of reverence, not for their difficulty, but for their stillness. In the floating world, the absence of spectacle was its own kind of performance. Merchants waited in quiet shops, hands tucked into sleeves, watching the steam from tea rise and disappear into the cold air. They did not shout their wares. They waited for footsteps, for the hush of a customer arriving, their breath visible before their words. In a city where voices rarely raised themselves above the rustle of fabric or the creak of floorboards, the way a merchant greeted a guest, with a bow, a soft welcome, a perfectly timed silence, meant more than any slogan. This was not indifference. It was elegance, and it extended beyond the markets into the homes of craftsmen and artisans whose work continued even as the world outside slowed. Potters turned clay not to fill orders, but to master shape and form, to feel the rhythm of their own hands reflected in the curve of a bowl. Lacquer workers polished for hours what might never be praised. A woodblock printer spent entire afternoons aligning a single sheet, letting the ink settle before pulling the print slowly, as if not to startle it. These were not acts of haste, nor were they celebrated, but they were remembered. In the grain of the paper, the smoothness of the glaze, the warmth of a perfectly balanced cup. Meanwhile, the floating world continued to exist alongside the ordinary one, not above it, but just barely removed, like a layer of snow that remains untouched even after footsteps pass through. The pleasure quarters did not shut down for the cold, but rather became more intimate, more hushed. Visitors arrived wrapped tightly in robes and scarves, not seeking entertainment, but warmth of a different kind. A geisha's shamisen echoed more clearly in winter, its high, delicate notes traveling farther through thin air. A whispered poem carried the weight of a conversation, and the silence that followed it spoke even louder. In the bathhouses, steam rose in gentle columns, curling around bare branches seen through the lattice. Strangers sat shoulder to shoulder, their bodies warm, their minds adrift. Few words were exchanged. A nod, a sigh, the quiet splash of water as someone stood. There was no need to fill the space. The floating world allowed emptiness to have presence, and in that space, even solitude felt shared. As the new year approached, preparations began without urgency. Homes were swept clean, not for show, but to reset the air, to make room for what might come. Decorations were simple: pine branches, paper streamers, a few tangerines stacked carefully. Children practiced calligraphy in chilled rooms, their brushes slow and careful. their breath fogging the page as they leaned too close. The old year did not end with fireworks. It exhaled quietly, and the new year entered like mist, soft, uncertain, full of unseen paths. Even the city's rhythms shifted slightly, as if listening for a sign. At shrines, bells rang not to command attention, but to invite it. And each person who passed through the Toriti gate did so with the same intention, not to be noticed, but to be realigned. The floating world did not offer answers. It did not demand clarity. It offered instead a mirror to the quieter parts of life, the ones we often ignore, but never fully forget. It reminded the people of Edo, and perhaps reminds us now, that beauty is not in the noise of progress or the rush of ambition, but in the patient act of noticing, of attending, of simply being present with what is. As winter lingered and the snow began to melt, in slow drips from eaves and bridges, the city did not hurry toward spring. It waited, because in waiting, in stillness, in the quiet unfolding of time, the floating world lived most vividly, not above the earth, not beyond it, just gently, lightly beside it. As the seasons shifted once again, bringing with them the soft breath of spring, Edo began to stir with a quiet anticipation that was less about urgency and more about renewal. The cherry blossoms, having retreated for the winter, now reappeared like gentle whispers across the city's gardens and riverbanks, their pale pink and white petals painting the air with fleeting beauty. In the floating world, these blossoms were not merely flowers, but symbols of impermanence and grace, reminders that life's most precious moments are those that cannot be held for long. People took to the streets in softer steps, savoring the delicate scent that floated with the breeze, and gatherings were held beneath flowering branches, where tea was poured with careful hands and conversations drifted like petals on water. Ukiyo-e artists captured these scenes in exquisite detail, their woodblock prints immortalizing the serene landscapes, the wistful faces of passers-by, and the fleeting dance of petals in the air. Each print was a meditation on transience, an invitation to pause and reflect on the subtle changes that define existence. Meanwhile, the music of the floating world adapted to the awakening earth, the strings of the shamisen and the flutes weaving melodies that echoed the gentle rustling of new leaves. The kabuki theaters prepared new performances that celebrated nature's rebirth, their actors' movements fluid and deliberate, embodying the ebb and flow of life itself. Even the pleasure quarters embraced spring with renewed elegance. Courtesans adorned their kimonos with floral patterns, and lantern-lit evenings extended just a little longer as the air warmed. The city's winding canals mirrored the blossoming trees, creating a dreamscape where light and shadow played softly beneath bridges and narrow walkways. Yet despite this gentle celebration, the floating world never lost sight of its central truth, that beauty is most profound because it is fleeting. Every moment of joy or stillness was understood as part of a larger cycle, a delicate balance between holding on and letting go. This awareness shaped not only art and entertainment, but also everyday life. Merchants and artisans planned their work around the seasons, aware that the world they lived in was constantly moving, shifting, changing. Even the most mundane tasks, sweeping a floor, arranging flowers, folding a sleeve, were performed with an unspoken reverence, as if acknowledging their place in this endless flow. As spring advanced, festivals blossomed too, quiet and introspective rather than loud or raucous. Lanterns were released on rivers, their soft glows floating downstream like whispers of hope and remembrance. Children learned traditional dances beneath blooming plum trees, their movements slow and precise, echoing the elegance of their ancestors. In private homes, families gathered for tea ceremonies that honored the moment with simplicity and grace. There was no hurry to finish, no need to speak beyond the necessary, just the gentle clink of porcelain, the delicate scent of matcha, and the slow passage of time itself. The floating world's power was not in spectacle, but in these small rituals that wove people together across generations and social strata. It reminded them that while the city might bustle and life might change, some things, the breath of spring, the touch of a flower petal, the sound of a lullaby, remain steady and true. And so, as you rest now, breathing softly and allowing your mind to drift like a petal on the wind, imagine Edo in springtime. The lanterns flicker faintly through the mist, the cherry blossoms fall slowly, one by one, carpeting quiet streets. Somewhere, a shamisen plays a melody, just for you, its notes as delicate and fleeting as the world itself. Here, in the floating world, time does not rush, it floats, and in this gentle suspension, you find peace. As the gentle glow of Edo's lanterns faded into the stillness of night, the floating world revealed its most intimate moments. Those quiet instants where time seemed to pause and breath became a shared rhythm between body and soul. Within the narrow streets and hidden alcoves, the soft murmur of conversation blended with the distant clinking of teacups and the faint, almost imperceptible melody of a shakuhachi flute weaving through the air, like a slow river winding through bamboo groves. The world outside might have been bustling during the day, but nightfall brought a different pace, a hush that invited reflection rather than action, a calm that held space for dreams yet to be formed. In the tea houses, patrons lingered long after the last drop of matcha had been consumed, their conversations trailing into silences filled only by the crackle of burning charcoal and the rustle of silk robes settling into stillness. Geisha moved like shadows. Their presence felt more than seen, offering smiles and nods that spoke volumes without disturbing the fragile quiet. Behind paper walls, the art of subtlety was refined to perfection. A glance, a tilt of the head, the gentle lifting of a fan could express gratitude, longing, or farewell with a grace that no spoken word could match. Meanwhile, in the rooms where ukiyo-e prints were created, artists and printers worked deep into the night, their motions deliberate and unhurried. Each brushstroke and carved line was a meditation on impermanence, capturing fleeting moments of beauty that would soon fade like the cherry blossoms on the river. The collaboration between designer, carver, and printer was a silent dance, a careful balance between precision and spontaneity, honoring the idea that art, like life, was most profound when it embraced transience. As the seasons turned and the cycle of birth, growth, decay, and renewal continued, the floating world remained a sanctuary for those seeking respite from the strictures of class, duty, and expectation. In the pleasure quarters, courtesans and their patrons savored these stolen moments with the knowledge that all was temporary. Yet in this knowledge lay a profound appreciation for the present. The floating world did not promise permanence or security. It offered instead a space where joy, sorrow, and beauty could be experienced fully, if only for a while, like a delicate blossom held briefly in the hand and before releasing it to the wind. Even beyond Edo's city limits, in the quiet countryside, this philosophy touched daily life. Farmers tending their rice paddies observed the changing seasons with reverence, knowing that their work was part of a larger pattern, a fleeting but essential dance with nature's rhythms. Village festivals, though simple, echoed the same themes: celebrations of impermanence, gatherings where stories were told and memories shared, all under skies that shifted from brilliant sun to starlit darkness. And as you lie here now, in your own quiet space, far removed from Edo's streets and tea houses, allow yourself to be carried on this gentle current of thought. Imagine the soft glow of lantern light filtering through shoji screens, the delicate scent of incense mingling with the crisp night air, the faint lingering notes of a melody that seems to reach across centuries. Feel the slow, rhythmic pulse of a city that moves not with urgency, but with grace. A city that understands the beauty in letting go, the peace in impermanence, the comfort in shared silence. In this moment, you too are part of the floating world, drifting on the gentle tides of time, wrapped in the warmth of stories whispered softly through the night. Here, there is no rush, no demand, only the slow unfolding of night into dawn, of dreams into rest, of presence into peace. As dawn softly crept over Edo, the floating world began to stir once again, its delicate rhythms resuming with the slow grace of unfolding petals. The first light filtered through paper screens, casting patterns of shadow and warmth across wooden floors, while the faint scent of freshly brewed tea mingled with the crisp morning air. The city awoke not with clamorous noise, but with the measured, respectful movements of its inhabitants, each performing their roles with an unspoken harmony that echoed centuries of tradition. Courtesans prepared for their day, their silk robes rustling like whispers as they moved through narrow corridors, while artists set out their brushes and inks, eager to capture the fleeting beauty of the moment, the gentle curve of a blossoming branch, the tranquil reflection of a temple in a still pond. Merchants opened their shops with quiet care, arranging wares and lighting lanterns that had been carefully cleaned the night before. Even the rickshaw pullers, who would soon ferry passengers through winding streets, began their morning with deliberate stretches and low bows to those they passed. In this unfolding day, the floating world was both a place and a state of mind, a delicate balance between duty and delight, between permanence and impermanence. Life here was an art form, crafted not for grand spectacle, but for subtle beauty, for moments that could be savored and then let go without regret. The ukiyo-e prints that adorned shop walls and private chambers alike captured this ethos with quiet precision. Scenes of seasonal festivals, tranquil gardens, and intimate portraits of geishas and actors told stories not of conquest or power, but of the delicate dance of everyday existence. Each print was a pause, a breath, a meditation on the transience that defines all things. Outside, the city's canals mirrored the soft hues of the morning sky, their waters reflecting lanterns that had yet to be extinguished, and rooftops that still wore the gentle patina of night's embrace. Fishermen prepared their nets with care, while children played along the banks, their laughter muted by distance but full of life. And beneath it all, the spirit of the floating world endured, not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a living, breathing presence woven into the fabric of daily life. It whispered in the rustle of silk kimono. It sang in the delicate pluck of a shamisen string. It lingered in the spaces between conversation and silence. As you lie quietly now, breathing softly and letting your mind drift with the ebb and flow of these scenes, imagine yourself walking slowly through Edo's lantern-lit streets, feeling the texture of time beneath your feet and the gentle pulse of history surrounding you. You are part of this floating world, where every moment is precious because it is fleeting, and every silence holds its own meaning. Here, there is no rush, no urgency, only the slow, deliberate unfolding of life in its most delicate form. As the city awakens, so too do your thoughts settle deeper into calm. Let the peacefulness of Edo's floating world carry you gently toward rest, its timeless beauty wrapping around you like a soft, warm silk robe, soothing, embracing, inviting you to linger a little longer in the quiet grace of night's gentle ending and morning's tender beginning. And now, as your eyes close softly, your breath slows and your heart finds stillness, know that you carry with you a piece of this serene world, a world that, though it floats on the currents of time, remains forever anchored in peace. Thank you so much for watching this video. Wishing you a new day filled with good luck and gentle moments. Until next time, take care and see you again here on Sleep Whisper.